Teacher Kristen McAuliffe. During the 6-day mission, McAuliffe will teach 2 lessons from space. The sunny South got hit in the jaw today with an icy punch. Cars were slipping and sliding this morning in Atlanta traffic. Temperatures are falling throughout the South, raising an alarm with...
Extended the amount of time that they can launch today to 1:07 Eastern Standard Time. That allows them about an hour and 3 or 4 minutes to get Challenger off of the launch pad and into space. They decided to extend it a half hour to possibly allow the winds to slow down a little bit. But as you can see in the picture, the palm trees are blowing rather steadily. They have a maximum of about 20-mile-an-hour winds, crosswinds especially, at the Kennedy Space Center runway, the 3-mile runway that they would come back on if there is a problem. Right now, the winds are in excess of that. They are holding at 9 minutes. So anytime they decide that the winds are acceptable, they can start the countdown clock, and they will launch probably 9 minutes after that. But as it stands right now, they are in a no-go launch situation. Challenger is firmly rooted to the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center. Unless the winds calm down, it will stay there until at least tomorrow. Bella? Space Shuttle on the launch pad in Florida, but it's something that's occurred this morning. We have something even stranger. Here is a shot we're going to show you of 8 members of an ice team. They are working on the launch pad now, clearing away the icicles so they can hopefully go ahead with their scheduled launch time of 11:38 Eastern Time. You can see the men down at the right base of the shuttle. They are moved into the area. They will stay there probably for the next 10 or 15 minutes, knocking off the icicles that have been on the launch pad. Once again, 11:38 Eastern Time. That is the new scheduled time for the launch. We will update you, of course, if that changes. Patrick and Molly?
Oh. Tom, thank you very much. I could almost do that. I've gotten some practice the last couple of days.
And it's 2 minutes, 44 seconds in counting.
This will be the first time that NASA has been able to launch from their second pad. This will give NASA flexibility in a year where they have 15 launches scheduled. This launch pad has not been used for a decade now. The last was in the Apollo program. During the 6 days in space, the astronauts are going to release a $100 million satellite and another one called Halley Spartan that will study the comet. But the highlight on this mission is the including in the flight of Kristen McAuliffe, a 37-year-old high school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. She was selected from over 11,000 teacher applicants to be the first private citizen to fly into space. She will teach from class, from space, on Friday now. If they are able to get off today, they will have live coverage here on CNN of her giving lessons to students on the ground. They are now within 2 minutes as they make the final preparations. The computers have taken control now.
Coming up on the 92nd point in our countdown. 90 seconds in counting. The 51L mission ready to go. The liquid hydrogen tank now at flight pressure and all 3 engines ready to go. Coming up on the 1-minute point in our countdown. T-minus 1 minute and counting. Sound suppression water system now armed. The hydrogen burn igniters have been armed. These igniters will be fired at T-minus 10 seconds to burn off any residual hydrogen gas. T-minus 45 seconds and counting. The solid rocket booster flight instrumentation recorders have gone into the record mode. Coming up on the 32nd point in our countdown. T-minus 30 seconds, and we've had a go for auto sequence start. The SRB hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
We're awaiting word. They're holding their breath just, I'm sure, as everyone else is. You saw it just a few moments ago, about 45 seconds after liftoff, a huge fireball in the sky.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect. We will report more as we have information available. Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
In what appears to be a major catastrophe in America's space program, Challenger, only seconds after leaving the launch pad, according to NASA, has exploded in midair. No word yet on if there are any survivors. Let's replay the launch here and show you, we'll continue to watch the picture and show you what happened shortly after liftoff.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
9 miles. This is a live picture now. You can see what appears to be a ship off of the Kennedy Space Center. Just saw a splash in the water. Don't know if that was one of the solid rocket boosters or part of the shuttle. Pieces of debris continuing to fall from the sky.
This is Mission Control, Houston. We have no additional word at this time.
The long-range NASA cameras tracking some object now in the sky, trailing a plume of black smoke behind it. Once again fixed.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact in the water at a point approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west.
Just saw another large piece of debris falling.
We are awaiting verification from as to the location of the recovery forces in the field to see what may be possible at this point. And we will keep you advised as further information becomes available. This is Mission Control.
On board the Space Shuttle this morning, Commander Francis Dick Scobie, co-pilot Michael Smith, Judith Resnik, Ronald Mcnair, Gregory Jarvis, and Christopher McAuliffe, and Ellison Azuka. Let's take another look now, just seconds into the launch. This is before the solid rockets were lit.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
Tom, everything looks normal to this point?
It's about 20 seconds.
Everything looks normal to this point. It's when the long-range tracking cameras took over, and you could see an extreme close-up as the solid rocket boosters appeared to be breaking away from the shuttle and then explode. It comes up in just a few seconds here.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
It occurred at 9 miles into the mission downrange.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go throttle up. There.
You could see right before the explosion at the external tank where it attaches to the shuttle, a flame appeared to break out between the external tank and the shuttle.
Tom, this has never happened before. I know you are aware that there are contingency plans for such an event. Because it's never happened before, I think possibly many people even involved are not aware of what they are. Do they have ships standing by?
There are recovery ships standing by, and they do go through procedures for launch aborts. There is worst case scenario. Let's go now to the live picture. We see a parachute.
What kind of parachutes do they have, Tom? How many do they have? How much can they hold? Do you have any information?
They're not wearing parachutes per se in the cockpit. There are no ejection seats.
We are coordinating with recovery forces in the field.
Originally in the program, they had ejection seats.
Range safety equipment, recovery vehicles intended for the recovery of the SRB in the general area.
We don't know what's attached to that parachute.
We can't tell from
Those
that
parachutes
camera
are
angle.
believed
It's
to
just
be
too far away.
paramedics going into that area.
It appeared, Tom, that just as they gave a command to Challenger, to the crew, for thrust,
To repeat,
Right,
we
to
have
throttle up the engine.
that was what triggered the
apparently
explosion.
normal ascent with the data coming to all positions being normal up through approximately the time of main engine throttle back up to 104%.
Yeah, what are you now?
We're looking at
approximately a minute or so into
the new launch pad,
there was an apparent
39,
explosion.
at the Kennedy Space Center.
The flight dynamics officer reported that tracking reported that the vehicle had exploded and impacted the water in an area approximately located at 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. Recovery forces are proceeding to the area, including ships and a C-130 aircraft.
Tom, did you say the craft was 9 miles downrange?
Flight controllers reviewing their
That
data
was the
here in
last
mission
thing we
control.
heard, 9 miles downrange, and just preparing to throttle back
will,
up
provide
over
you with more
100%.
information
We
as
have
it becomes
CNN's John
available.
Zarella,
This
who
Mission
is at the
Control,
Kennedy
Houston.
Space Center on the live line now. John, you could, I'm sure, see it from your vantage point, even 9 miles down. Describe the scene there.
Tom, it was just a situation where everything looked fine, and then all of a sudden it looked like a giant fireworks display overhead. The weather and the sky being so clear, you could of course see it for miles and miles. And at first, no one was quite sure what we had seen. Everyone was just sort of standing around as if things were going normally. But of course, when I saw that fireworks, sort of a fireworks display, I said, "This is not right. It's not something that I had ever seen before." And at that point, I began questioning what had happened, as we all did. But here now at the Kennedy Space Center, everybody's just stunned. They're in shock. It's a situation where people are just sort of standing around in just bewilderment at this point. And of course, we're not getting any information from here any more than what you are. Only just what we have just witnessed and what we've seen, this tragic incident. It just seemed like everything was going fine, as you said, up until about 9 miles downrange. And then that giant explosion of colors that, it just looked like a 4th of July fireworks explosion. And certainly the most tragic incident to ever befall the space program, at least at this point it seems that way. That's about all I really know.
John, we understand that a C-130 aircraft and several ships are now headed to that point about 9 miles downrange. Can you see any of the recovery efforts going on?
Negative. Not from our vantage point here up on the mound where the press area is. It's all we can see is, of course, the gantry and the empty launch pad, and in front of us the clock, which is still ticking at 12 minutes and now 50 seconds into what would have been the flight. And that is all we can see from this point. Of course, journalists scurrying around and everyone trying to just find out what indeed has happened here today. But no, we can see no activity at all. I did hear a helicopter flying overhead a while ago in the distance, and that was about the only sign at this point from where we are.
We saw a parachute that was floating down probably about 12 or 13 minutes after the explosion. Any word from NASA officials there about that parachute?
No, nothing. As a matter of fact, with just the naked eye, we couldn't tell what it was that was floating down. I certainly couldn't. And NASA is of course not saying much of anything at this point until, as I say, they get the recovery ships out there and get the vehicles out there to see what they can find out in the Atlantic Ocean. At this point, though, no word from NASA. They are, of course, as concerned, more so than anybody else in this entire country right now, and want to get everything straight before they start giving out any kind of information. I'm sure we're going to have to wait until those recovery vehicles get out there to the site.
We understand now that the parachute that we saw possibly may be from that C-130, medical personnel and frogmen going into the area. John, you and I have both been at the Kennedy Space Center several times. Every mission, before every mission, they go through the rehearsals of what to do if an emergency develops.
That's correct. And of course, at this point, this early on, it's so difficult to speculate, but it just seemed that it happened so suddenly that all of a sudden this giant burst of fire, these giant colors, the reds and the blues, that it's just who knows whether or not they had time to rehearse any kind of an emergency procedure at this point. If it was just an instantaneous explosion that no one was expecting, which it seems to be the case right now, God knows whether they had any kind of time to react to that, to prepare for an emergency like this.
Well, the explosion that we saw just a few minutes ago, we're back now to a live picture from a helicopter above the launch area. This is Mission Control in Houston. For the last 4 or 5 minutes, the audio channel from Mission Control has been silent. Not a single word has been spoken while the rescue efforts, if there are any to be made, are underway.
That's the same here, Tom. We're getting nothing here from NASA at the Kennedy Space Center. It has been just dead silence. And over in the press dome where the press gathers, it is much the same. A very, very gloomy atmosphere, and no one saying anything. Just standing around and staring in bewilderment and really not knowing what to say or how to say it at this point, I think, is the best way to put it.
John, of paramount concern, of course, is the fate of the 7 people aboard the spacecraft. Bearing in mind that we have very little information, let's go for a second with what we have. Do we know at what height the craft exploded?
I have no information at all on that. All I can say is that because it was such a clear day and you could just see for miles, it was certainly in full view when it happened. And I have no idea what kind of height that would have been. It did not seem to be that far out over the water when it happened because of the trajectory of the liftoff. It seemed that it was carrying it almost well straight up from our vantage point. A little, obviously not, but a little over the ocean. And at that point, you could still see it in full view. And then all of a sudden, at first you might have thought were separation of boosters, but of course we know that doesn't take place that early on in the mission. The shuttle had just made its roll and was on its way upward, and then suddenly that explosion. But again, it was in full view, so it certainly could not have been at a very, very high altitude when it happened, and certainly could not have been very, very far downrange.
John, we have some information from NASA right now as to exactly where parts of the spacecraft fell. They were reporting it fell at 28.64 north latitude and 80.28 degrees west longitude, just a few miles off Cape Canaveral.
That would make very, very good sense, Marianne. That's exactly what it seemed like here. Pieces of debris, of course, falling back into the ocean, and you could see them falling. And again, not knowing what it was that was falling off, but knowing entirely throughout the entire few moments after it happened that this was not right. You knew that it wasn't that far downrange or that high in altitude when it happened. I don't know, obviously, how far out, but certainly, again, reiterate, it does not seem like it was at a very, very high altitude or very out in the far out, and it would seem to indicate that they can get to the debris fairly quickly. Of course, recovery ships are always standing by. And again, going back to a point we made earlier, if this had been something they had practiced for, something that they could have aborted and come back to Kennedy Space Center, I'm sure they would have done that. It just seems at this point that it was an unforeseen cataclysmic tragedy that may have befallen us here today, and that there was no way to make any kind of emergency preparations to come back to KSC with the shuttle itself at this point.
John, we will stand by at the Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back now about 5 hours ago when the 7 members of the shuttle crew were entering in to the spacecraft. Here you see 37-year-old New Hampshire teacher Christy McAuliffe preparing to...
Good morning, Aurora. Good morning, Judy.
There's Judy Resnik on the intercom. She's already inside the shuttle. On the left, you see 39-year-old Ellison Onizuka. For those of you who may just be joining us, the 25th Space Shuttle mission has apparently ended in tragedy in a huge fireball in the sky. Apparently, the solid rocket booster exploded about 9 miles downrange. The $1.2 billion spacecraft, only one of 4 in the fleet. This was only the second of a record 15 shuttle flights NASA had planned for this year. NASA says the explosion occurred about 60 seconds into the flight, where they were preparing to throttle their engines up to maximum thrust. They had throttled them down to the 60% level at about 35 seconds. in order to reduce the forces of gravity during the liftoff.
Throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
The explosion occurred at a time when Challenger was to enter a period of the maximum stress, when wind and other atmospheric conditions could place the maximum force on the outside of the vehicle. There you see the huge fireball and 2 solid rockets trailing white smoke. That is one of the solid rockets there. After the explosion, we could not see the orbiter itself. Apparently exploded in little pieces, and only the 2 solid rockets floated down. This is a live picture off the Florida coast at the Kennedy Space Center from one of NASA's helicopters. We cannot see any of the rescue efforts underway. They apparently are heading down downrange. Let's go to the White House now and Larry speaks.
And shocked at what he has just seen replayed on television concerning the shuttle launch. We do not have any more information than is being provided to the public at this time. The way the President found out about it is he was in the Oval Office with a group of senior staff preparing for some questions with a group of network correspondents and anchors that were having lunch in the White House today regarding the budget and the State of the Union. The Vice President and the Foreign Policy Advisor, John Poindexter, came in with others and informed the President that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the President's study, where there's a television, and the President then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the President is concerned, he is saddened, he is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information as to the condition of the crew, Larry, at this point?
We don't have any more information than what is being provided to the public on television. Hopefully later we will be able to get some, and that's the President's first priority, is to find out what information that is available. We just don't have any more. No, we have not from the Oval Office.
Will this affect in any way the plans for the State of the Union tonight?
I don't believe so. I'm certain that the President will feel compelled to mention this, depending on the outcome of what we learn here in a few minutes.
Will it affect the shuttle program, Larry?
Well, that's hard to say, you know, here in 15 or 20 minutes after an incident of this type is concerned. I'm sure it will not affect the United States' determination to consider to continue the exploration of space and all the benefits we've received from it. While this is indeed tragic, it certainly will not deter the United States in its interest in space exploration.
All the problems that the shuttle has had, will any substantial reevaluation be done of the program itself?
Well, once again, you're very premature in asking a question concerning the future of the space program. The United States has met adversity many times before in the space program. It is one of the most effective and successful programs of that type that any country has ever undertaken.
Larry, can you tell us anything specifically that the President said, any quotations, and did he make any mention of the fact that the teacher that he suggested, that the program of a teacher in space, that teacher was on board this flight?
Well, I know that was on his mind. Quite frankly, the President stood there in almost stunned silence as he watched the television. You could certainly read the concern, the sorrow, the anxiety on his face as he watched, and the group watched around him. As I say, he was virtually watched in silence.
Might anyone from the White House be leading some sort of investigating team, or will it just be up to NASA to investigate this?
All this is very, very early, and there's just nothing we can say. Our immediate concern is the crew, and all of these other questions will just have to be deferred until much later.
Was anything said about the fact that the teacher was on board this plane?
Well, it was something that was on all of our minds, that we did have the first teacher in space, really the first civilian, so to speak, other than our members of Congress who have flown. in space, and certainly that's on our mind.
Are there any scientific aides who have been able to say that they could survive such an explosion as witnessed?
Just don't have that kind of information
You
yet.
said that the Vice President, Admiral Poindexter, informed the President. How did the White House learn about it?
I'm certain that we probably learned it from the news media, as we do many times when incidents like this occur unexpectedly.
Might this influence the decision about whether other civilians will be allowed on the shuttle from now on?
Once again, all of these questions, our immediate concern is for the fate of the crew, to find out exactly what has happened to those 7 people aboard. All of these other questions we'll just have to wait till later. Dale?
Tell us anything about what the President's schedule, how the President's schedule is changing now?
The President's schedule has not changed. He will keep on with what he had planned today and the State of the Union tonight. And once again, I think the only change in his schedule would be to simply be updated and try to seek the facts in this.
Will the President be making any phone calls to the family, Larry?
I just don't know. It customarily does, but we're going to wait till we find out what the facts are.
Larry, he watched in silence, but were there no quotes that you could give us?
Nothing. It was virtually in silence.
Are you going to know what's being done now, Larry, in terms of searching for...
No. All of that information we just do not have yet. Dale, you had one question and you want to go? Okay.
What are your plans? What are your plans about briefing the rest of the afternoon on that?
Well, I think once we find out what the facts are and particularly what the fate of the crew is, then we'll be prepared to say something.
Larry, did you detect any sign of emotion as the President watched? Was he shaking his head? Was his eyes moist?
Concern, anxiety, silence.
You say something like
All right, you're looking at a live picture off the Kennedy Space Center from what looks like the vantage point on the vehicle assembly building. Let's go back in time now about 20 minutes as Challenger was ready for liftoff as the last few seconds ticked off the clock.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
Liftoff this morning at 11:38 after a couple of delays for several hours.
4%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
The family of Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian and the first school teacher ever to be launched into space aboard a shuttlecraft, was at the Kennedy Space Center watching today's liftoff. This is not only, of course,
2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3
let's watch
miles, downrange
as we see what happened.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Close lights.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
This is a slow motion replay of the explosion. In looking at the slow motion replay, you could see flames break out. There you see one of the solid rocket boosters careening off to the right, still erupting a long tail of flame behind it. In the center of the fire and the smoke, you can't see any form of what was once the shuttle. The one solid rocket booster still moving off to the right. A little later, you can see the other solid rocket go to the left.
we are still not clear as yet, Tom, exactly what was parachuting down here.
We're not clear, but we know that a C-130 was in the area and that medical personnel were dispatched by parachute down into the water to search for survivors.
So this is possibly a rescue effort.
That's right. This came about 12 or 12 and a half minutes after the explosion. All right, the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger, Francis Dick Scobie, was the spacecraft commander. He was born in May of 1939 in Washington State. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Michael Smith, who was the pilot of Challenger, commander in the United States Navy, he was born April 30th, 1945 in Beaufort, North Carolina. He became a NASA astronaut in 1980. Judith Resnik, on the top right, is one of 3 mission specialists that were aboard Challenger. She was born April 5th, 1949 in Akron, Ohio. She joined NASA's Astronaut Corps in 1978. Ronald Mcnair, bottom right, PhD, mission specialist. He joined NASA in 1978 as an astronaut. He was born October 21st, 1950 in Lake City, South Carolina. Ellison S. Unzuka, Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force, was a mission specialist, top left. Became an astronaut in 1978. He was born in Hawaii, June 24th, 1946. Gregory B. Jarvis, payload specialist, was born August 24th, 1944 in Detroit. He was a test and integration manager for the F-1 and F-2 and F-3 spacecraft in 1983. And finally, Christian McAuliffe, the teacher in space participant, on the top row on the left side of the center, born September 2nd, 1948 in Boston. She received her BA degree from Remington State College and master's degree in education from Bowie, Maryland. She's taught English and American history since 1970 until her selection from 11,000 other teachers. As a NASA teacher in space, she taught economics, law, American history, and of course she developed the American woman. Okay, let's now go to Bob Kane. Bob?
Tom, we've just learned from a wire report that the students at Christa McAuliffe's high school in New Hampshire were watching the liftoff along with hundreds of thousands of other Americans. They cheered wildly as they saw the shuttle take off in an apparently nominal, very good launching, and then sat in stunned silence when they saw the craft and its fuel tanks blow up. The school principal, Charles Foley, immediately ordered reporters and photographers out of the school. Students were ordered back to their classrooms, and Principal Foley said he would have more to say when he learned what had happened. Marion.
We have already, Bob, of course, had reaction from the White House as White House spokesman Larry Speets described the president's reaction when he was told by the vice president about this tragedy. He was described as being saddened and anxious. There is more official word in response to this from Washington, and let's go to Reed Collins for that. Reed?
Of course, Marianne, the word of the Challenger catastrophe struck Washington like a winter thunderbolt. The House of Representatives was in session at 11:38 Eastern Time this morning, but not for long. The House chaplain, very quickly upon learning of the news, offered a prayer for those off the coast of Florida. James Ford presented the wishes and the will of the House to a chilled and cold House of Representatives.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray. May your Spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
And the House of Representatives prayed for the possible survivor of the 7 of the shuttle. Then the Speaker, Tip O'Neill, adjourned the House until 2 p.m. this afternoon. And that is only a portion of the effect of the tragedy of Challenger as far as it affects the nation's capital now, Bob.
Thank you, Reed. And we will pause now at CNN in our coverage for 10 seconds of silence.
You are looking at the 7 crew members of the Space Shuttle Challenger's mission. We have no official word as of yet on their fate, but the explosion, as you saw, was a tremendous and disastrous one.
There was no hint of any problem at all other than what we came to regard almost affectionately as weather-related and technical gremlin-type problems that afflict the space program. It had been subject to several weather-imposed delays. A mechanical problem yesterday added to the problems. And then we heard that it might be launched at 11:38 this morning.
There were tremendous cheers at NASA and also among the school children watching their school teacher become the first private citizen in space. And everything seemed to be going as planned and as scheduled and according to form. But then at 11:38...
3 minutes before launch time, correspondent Tom Mintier joined us on the set to begin our live coverage of the launch. Tom.
Bob, the only concern that NASA really showed this morning was with the icicles, some of them 2 foot long, and it might be proper to go back and look and think about the situation with that. They were very concerned. They called an emergency meeting at the Kennedy Space Center to discuss whether the ice on the pad area could possibly damage the shuttle on liftoff. There was concern about the heat shielding tiles possibly being pierced by those icicles. NASA has never gone through ice in the launch pad area before, and they decided at that meeting that it posed no danger, and they went ahead with the countdown. They were concerned, of course, with the low temperatures in the area. 2 days ago, when they decided to cancel for the weather the first time and did not go on the last Sunday, and then moved it up again, and were forced to cancel yesterday because of high winds in the landing area, winds that exceeded NASA flight rules. Associate Administrator Jess Moore previously, when pressured about NASA being so far behind schedule this year already with 2 missions only flown, stated emphatically that we will never compromise safety standards for schedule. Those were his words just a few days ago. Let's go back now in time a little bit to 11:38 Eastern Time as the last few seconds ticked away from the clock. You'll see the shuttle's 3 main engines.
We have main engine
They light
start.
there.
4, 3, 2,
Everything appeared
1,
normal at this point.
And liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
This was the first time that a shuttle had launched from the pad that had not been used for 10 years back in the Apollo program.
Now heading downrange.
The second pad would have allowed NASA to have their ambitious schedule of 15 missions this year.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%.
The roll procedure completed.
For most of the flight, 104%.
You see the 700-foot flames trailing the 2 white solid rocket boosters, and that brown tank is the external tank that contains the volatile fuel to fire those.
Normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900.
Let's look at the slow motion. You see the fire right at the bottom of the external tank, just above the flames. Then fire breaks out on the other side of the external tank. Then it explodes. It appears that the center of the external tank was the start of the explosion as it blew apart and turned into a huge fireball about 9 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen the white solid rocket still in flames, shooting off to the right. And the next shot, you'll see the other solid rocket still intact, shooting off to the left. The shuttle Challenger itself is attached to the external tank in several places. The two solid rocket boosters sit on the left and right side of that brown external tank. In that position, the shuttle was underneath. 11:38 this morning, it now appears that there are no survivors from Space Shuttle Challenger, the 25th mission, and the only fatalities since 1967, when 3 astronauts were killed in a fire at the Kennedy Space Center. Marianne?
First, as you said, Tom, the first in-air disaster in the manned in space program of the United States. Let's go back to Washington now and read Collins.
Well, as we know, the president has been informed. He is saddened. He is anxious, according to Larry Speaks. We'll hear more about that. The House of Representatives has adjourned after its chaplain said a prayer for those 7, their families, and, of course, for the nation. The House of Representatives has trooped quietly out of the Capitol Hill. In front of a chilled White House, chilled the more so because of the events of this past hour, my colleague Charles Bierbauer. Charles?
Reed, we know that the president was in the Oval Office at the time of the explosion, actually preparing for a briefing with some reporters on his State of the Union address tonight. Word was brought to him by National Security Advisor Admiral John Poindexter and the vice president. He went immediately to his study, watched a rerun of the explosion on television there, and White House spokesman Larry Speaks conveyed to us just a few moments ago the president's reaction.
The Union. The vice president and the foreign policy advisor John Poindexter came in with others and informed the president that the news had just broken. We immediately adjourned our Oval Office meeting and went into an adjoining room, the president's study, where there's a television, and the president then began to review television reports of the explosion there shortly after the launch. So once again, the president is concerned. He is saddened. He is very anxious to have more information on it. At the moment, as I say, we're learning most of our information from what the public is getting.
What is your best information?
Spokesman Speaks said that the president watched the explosion, the tape replay, in stunned silence, that he really did not say much, but that the tragic emotion was on his face and very evident. Speaks said that, of course, the White House is trying to get further information, that was their top priority, to find out just what had happened, particularly the concern for the crew. It was, of course, President Reagan who came up with the program for sending a teacher in space, the first civilian to make that trip. And there is that distinct link between the president and the space program. In response to most questions, the White House spokesman really could not make any definitive answer at this point, too much unknown. As far as the space program itself goes, Spokesman Larry Speaks said, despite the tragedy, that should not deter the U.S. space program, which has been one of this nation's great successes. Agreed?
Charles, of course, the president has a public duty to perform tonight his State of the Union address at 9 Eastern Time. It seems, does it not, almost inevitable that this is going to cast a long and mournful shadow over even that?
Well, the president had hoped to make the kind of speech that was being described here as visionary, laying out his hopes for this country into the next century. I think it is fair to guess, in fact, Mr. Speaks sort of indicated that the president would be compelled to have something to say about this tragedy, and I think we will hear that tonight. Yes, it does indeed cast a pall on this event.
But that is the latest live from the White House, where, as Charles says, the president has been informed. And now let's go back to the scene in NASA Live.
Approximately a minute or so after tower clear, there was an apparent explosion of the orbiter. At the time, data was lost approximately a minute into the flight. That was shortly after throttle up to 104% of the 3 main engines. The flight director pulled positions, flight controller positions in the room later on and this morning, and was informed that there were no anomalous indications at the time. Tracking reported impact of the vehicle with the water. According to data, that was approximately 18 miles downrange at the time data stopped. Recovery forces being deployed to the field, were unable shortly to enter the specific area because of continuing falling debris, and at about this time are being admitted to the impact area. Contingency procedures are in effect, and following those procedures, all of the data available in mission control from the flight at the point or up to the point of the incident, data is being secured and will be carefully evaluated. We have no additional information at this time, and we'll keep you advised as other details become available. This is Mission Control, Houston.
Among the Americans who saw the devastation that struck America's space program and 7 people aboard the space shuttle were the husband of 37-year-old New Hampshire school teacher Krista McAuliffe and her 9-year-old daughter. It was last July 19th that CNN correspondent Tony Clark talked with Krista McAuliffe as she prepared for her role aboard the shuttle.
The training will start in September.
Did you think that you were ever going to fail in any part of the testing?
No, that wasn't really part of the evaluation process. So even if I had gotten sick on it, I'd still be all right.
Were you surprised by any of the testing or anything? Did you think it was harder than?
The intensity of it. Just lots and lots of things crammed into a week. I mean, we were just running from early in the morning till late at night.
Do you think that was part of the training or the testing?
Well, maybe, but I think they were also, they knew that we only had us for a short period of time. They were just trying to cram it as much as possible so that we could really experience everything that we could in that short period of time.
Scott said today you were going to take one of his pet frogs along on the flight. Is that going to be one of the pieces of the cargo?
Yes, we're going to put that frog right on the shuttle.
This is Scott?
This is Scott.
Scott, does the frog have a name yet? Legal, the frog is going to go into space? That's part of the deal. Did NASA know about this?
I do have a personal compartment on board the shuttle. I can't take some things along with me. Not big enough for any of you, but...
Actually, have you seen the inside? You must have seen the inside of one of these things.
Yeah.
A personal compartment. How comfortable is it?
It's probably about this big and about that wide, so that you can bring some things that you would like
personal
to bring.
Effects.
Yeah, the t-shirts that you're going to wear, and things for your family.
What kind of t-shirts you're going to wear?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to get a good New Hampshire one.
Can you tell us about the camaraderie between you and the other 9 finalists?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It really is. I mean, we went through so much. All I can liken it to is having a small bunch of big kisses.
Krista, finally, what's it like?
Where's Kitty Bob?
She's resting.
Oh, she's resting? Oh, who's with her? Oh.
Now it's 20 seconds.
A long 20 seconds. Is this like a countdown?
She will now start any minute. I don't know.
Dion, Krista is here with me now. She just got off the plane a while ago, and I know that you were chosen for this mission partly because of your disposition. You've been giggling since you got here. Tell me. Why, again, you've said it so many times, why is this so important to you, making this trip on the shuttle?
Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but I think the most important thing is to humanize the space age to a point where everybody feels a part of it, and the students really connect with that. They're the wave of the future. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the space stations and beyond, and I really hope and feel that it's part of the teaching profession to bring those new career opportunities. I know, it's wonderful.
Okay, all right, so how's it feel to be back in New Hampshire?
It feels great to to be home. I am really delighted because I kept hearing about all of these wonderful things that people were doing while I was down in Washington, while I was down in Houston, and I couldn't share with that. You know, and Steve would tell me on the phone, and he'd say, you know, you got some letters, or, you know, people called, and I couldn't share with that. So I'm really glad I'm home.
How long are you going to be home for?
Well, hopefully I'll be home on and off for about a month, so I'll be able to spend some time in New Hampshire.
Yeah. I've got to ask you, when did you find out? Did you find out just before the announcement, or?
Yeah, we did. We asked as a group, we requested that we find out prior to going into the room. It was a small room. There were a lot of press there. We've invested an awful lot of emotion in these last 2 weeks, and we really felt that we needed to find out and compose ourselves before walking into the room. So we did know before we walked in.
What were your feelings when you found out?
Well, it was rather funny when we were talking about what was happening at home, and I was saying something to the effect that, you know, well, you know, when I'm not home, and I said my husband really relies on cornflakes and milk because that's kind of his staple. And Ann Bradley turned around and kind of, without missing a beat, she turned around and she said to me while the whole group was together, she said, I think you better buy some more cornflakes and milk.
The students at Krista McAuliffe's Concord High School in New Hampshire were among those watching the launch, the liftoff on television. They cheered, and they continued to cheer, not realizing something had gone wrong, until a teacher hushed them, told them to be quiet because she knew something had gone wrong. At that point, students were overheard saying, "This can't be real, we can't be watching this." The school principal then asked all reporters and photographers to leave the school. Reed?
Bob, as we've heard, the president was in the White House. He quickly was summoned and watched some of the terrifying replays of the disaster that overtook Challenger. Across the Potomac, the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was in his office complex as well. He was conferring with other people about the business of defense. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Crowe, was with him, we understand. The secretary was advised of what had befallen the Challenger, and he quickly adjourned his meeting, went to an adjoining television room to watch. Caspar Weinberger watched, as you have also, and his comment was, "Oh, no." Then his concern was apparent from that comment only, shocked and disappointed. But the quote from the Secretary of Defense, probably that of all of America, Bob, "Oh, no." Marianne.
Also at the Cape, or just actually 3.5 miles from the Cape, watching as it happened this morning, were Krista McAuliffe's two parents, Edward and Grace Corrigan, were watching from a VIP area some 3.5 miles away. The wire services are reported observing the two of them hugging and sobbing as they saw the explosion aboard the shuttle. NASA, immediately after the explosion on the shuttle, was silent for quite some time, made hardly any reference rather than acknowledging that there had been an explosion and there were recovery efforts underway. We did have one official statement from NASA, and we'll play that back for you now.
We had an apparently nominal liftoff this morning at 11:38 Eastern Time. The ascent phase appeared normal through approximately the completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point, we had an apparent explosion. Subsequent to that, the tracking crews reported to the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle appeared to have exploded and that we had an impact in the water downrange at a location approximately 28.64 degrees north, 80.28 degrees west. At the time the data was lost with the vehicle, according to a poll by the flight director, Jay Green, of the positions here in Mission Control, there were no anomalous indications, no indications of problems with the engines or with the SRBs or with any of the other systems at that moment through the point at which we lost data. Again, this is preliminary information. It's all that we have at the moment.
Well,
It was about 1 minute into flight when the explosion took place, but for 55 minutes, downrange about 9 miles from the Kennedy Space Center, the debris continued to fall. That prevented, according to NASA, some of the emergency operations from moving into the area for that amount of time. But most of the pieces that we could at least see through our picture falling through after the explosion. Here's a replay in slow motion. You can see the fire develop on both sides of the external tank, and in about a half a second, you'll see it break apart right there. And it turns into a fireball. Then, one of the solid rocket boosters, can't tell whether it's the right one or the left one, careens off to the right-hand side, still intact. The solid rocket booster was intact. Huge fireball where the shuttle sits next to the external tank. There's the solid rocket that's going off to the right. And in just a second, you'll see the other solid rocket, also still intact, going to the left. The silence of NASA came when you were looking at the same pictures that we're looking at now, with all of the fire and the smoke. You couldn't really see through it to see if the shuttle was still there. The first indication that it wasn't was when they said they lost all communications, all downlink video with the shuttle. These are the spectators that were watching.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second, altitude 4.3 knots.
This is raw, unedited video, just sent via satellite.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 100%. Challenger, go with throttle up.
The picture you were just seeing was Christy McCullough's parents watching in horror. These are the students from her school. Many of them probably had their view blocked just as we did with the television cameras, with just a huge fireball and a huge cloud of smoke. They may not realize yet what has happened. You see concern etched on their faces, the breath that they've been holding released, and then the realization sets in that something is wrong. At that point, all that remained was...
Flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect.
Gave me the wrong stuff.
Edward and Grace Corrigan. They were about 3.5 miles away from the area of the launch pad in the VIP launch area.
The contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
Families of the astronauts normally in the grandstand.
Tom, as John Zarella pointed out from the Cape earlier, when all of us first saw the blast, there was a moment of stunned silence and disbelief. Many people perhaps did confuse it with the, is it the booster rockets?
The solid rocket booster separation, which
But it was
occurs
really,
a little later.
It was
came
far
much
too early and far too big an explosion. And it took a while, I'm sure, for it to sink in the minds of the parents and the school children.
There you see Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan still standing, saying a silent prayer. Those are Christian McAuliffe's parents.
It's Edward and Grace Corrigan. Mrs. Corrigan had said in an earlier interview with CNN that she would be thrilled to be the one to be up there herself. That she once took flying lessons just because she liked the adventure of it. They'd always encouraged their daughter to be adventurous and to go for it, in her words.
Tom, the area that we were just watching, the bleachers where people were watching and photographing the launch, who was allowed in there?
That is the VIP section, invited guests for this launch. I myself received an invitation from Michael Smith, who was the pilot on this flight, to sit in these same bleachers and to watch his launch. Michael Smith has been a guest here on CNN before on our launch coverage and sent me a special invitation to go.
That would then include family members of the astronauts, friends?
It includes family members. I understand there was a delegation from China of 100 people, school children from New Hampshire.
Challenger's pilot, as Tom just said, was Mike Smith, 40 years old. He was a commander in the U.S. Navy. He's from Beaufort, North Carolina, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He served in Vietnam, is married, and has 3 children. And we had an interview with him here on CNN back in July. Let's play that for you.
How important is the Halley satellite launch? I mean, what are you going to be able to do with that?
Well, the satellite is very important. If you talk to the folks that have put together the experiment from the University of Colorado, they're hoping to get some really valuable information. As Ron mentioned this morning in the press conference, the comet is at its closest approach to the sun during the period that we're going to be observing it with the experiment, and hopefully that's going to be the period where it has the most activity in terms of throwing off water or whatever it's made out of. And the spectrometers that are on the Spartan-Halley comet or the Spartan-Halley satellite are hopefully going to be able to give us the information to tell us what that material is made of, and from that, of course, we can go back, since the comets are remnants of the formation of the universe, hopefully how some of that process worked. So it's very important to us, and it's very important that we actually deploy the satellite and pick it up on schedule and without a lot of problems, because all the data that satellite gathers while it's out doing its mission is going to be contained on the satellite itself. There's no telemeter data coming back to the ground or anything, so we have to deploy it and pick it up.
Isn't that going to be the tricky part, is making sure you pick it up? I mean, what we were talking about earlier in the press conference, it's going to be night and finding the thing.
Well, it's going to be night as we approach the target. As we pass about 2,000 feet to 4,000 feet below the target, it will be night, but as we come up in front of the target on its velocity vector, the sun should just be coming over the horizon, and we should have a good view of the satellite at that point. And once we have stabilized on the velocity vector, we practiced it many, many times. Dick will be moving the shuttle in towards the satellite, and we'll put it about 35 feet over the bay, and Judy hopefully will pick it up with the arm. It'll be in the right orientation. If for some reason its attitude system does fail, it has some magnetic torquers that can put it in an attitude that'll allow us to pick it up with the arm. We also have some backup plans in case the arm is not working or the satellite is moving a little more than we would like to send Ellison Onizuka and Ron Mcnair out EVA, and Dick will actually fly the satellite down to where they can pick it up and put it in the bay. So we have some backup plans to pick that satellite up if there's anything wrong with either the orbiter or the satellite itself.
Yeah, because you don't get many chances to look at the the comet.
No, and if, like I said, if we don't get the satellite back, we don't have any data.
Yeah. Does it concern you, or does it concern the other astronauts that so much of the spotlight has been on Krista? Everything seems to be focusing on her, and we talk about teacher in space rather than, you've got a TDRS satellite, you've got Hughes doing the experiments really that may help in the design of future satellites. You're going to be looking at Halley's Comet. It's an important mission, but most of all the spotlight is on her.
Well, I don't think it concerns us. You know, once we knew the teacher was going to be on the flight, I think everyone expected all the interest and everything to go exactly that way. And that's probably the way it should be, since she is going to be doing something on the flight which hasn't ever been done before. And hopefully she's going to be doing the things that she mentioned earlier in the press conference this morning, and that is allowing teachers and students to experience this experience that you have in space, and hopefully transmit some of that enthusiasm to some of the students. I don't mean to minimize the other parts of the mission. They're very important. The Teeter's satellite is going to give us a lot more capability, certainly, than we have now to communicate with orbiters, and hopefully in the future the space station. And Spartan Halley is going to do some good scientific research, and Greg's projects are certainly important and will influence, I think, satellite design for many years to come.
Yeah,
and,
as you mentioned, she's going to get, hopefully, a lot of students interested in space and becoming astronauts. How did you get interested? Because there was no teacher in space to spur you.
I guess, you know, as far back as I can remember, all I ever wanted to do was fly. And when I was a young kid coming up, of course, the space program was just getting started, and my interest just naturally from the flying aspects went over to wanting to fly into space. And it's just something that I've wanted to do all my life. And I don't know how I got interested. I can't tell you. I just have always been interested in doing flying. So to me, it was just something that came naturally.
Natural evolution, yeah. And especially for this kind of craft. It's not like the rockets that we've got sitting outside at the front gate where you just really just ride. But at least, I mean, there are controls.
That's
and
right.
You are.
You know, it launches like a rocket, and while it's on orbit, it is a spacecraft, and then it transitions from a spacecraft back to a real airplane for landing. So that's very exciting.
There were 7 people aboard the Space Shuttle when the disaster struck shortly after launch this morning at Kennedy Space Center. The spacecraft commander was Francis R. Dick Scobie. He was born May 19th, 1939. He was in the Air Force. He fought in Vietnam. He'd logged about 6,500 hours in 45 different kinds of aircraft. Scobie was pilot of the STS-41C Challenger mission in 1984. That was the mission which retrieved and repaired aboard the shuttle the ailing Solar Maximum Mission satellite.
There were 2 women on board this flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger. One of them was astronaut Judith Resnik. She's 36 years old, a classical pianist who earned a doctorate in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. After college, Resnik was a research scientist for RCA, and then at the National Institutes of Health, and later for Xerox. She was selected as an astronaut back in 1978, born and raised in Akron, Ohio, and has a bachelor's degree from Carnegie Mellon University. Resnik trained on the shuttle's robot arm during her first flight. That was in 1984. She used the arm to delicately break away a chunk of ice that had built up on the Space Shuttle Discovery. Resnik was single, 36 years old.
The other woman aboard was Krista McAuliffe. She was 37 years old, a Concord, New Hampshire high school English teacher, also taught American history. She was selected as the primary candidate for the NASA Teacher in Space project in July 1985. She began her training last September and had completed it nominally, as NASA says, normally, in time for today's launch. She was born in Boston, graduated from Framingham State College. She had a master's degree in education from Bowie State College in Bowie, Maryland. She had a 9-year-old daughter who, along with her husband, was watching this morning's launch at Kennedy Space Center, along with her parents.
Also aboard today's shuttle mission, Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Ellison S. Onizika, 39 years old, a former aerospace engineer and pilot who taught courses at the Elite Air Force Test Pilot School in California. Born in Hawaii, has 2 degrees from the University of Colorado, was selected by NASA to be an astronaut in 1978. A crew member on the secret Department of Defense space shuttle flight last January. This was his 2nd space flight. He's married to the former Lorna Leiko Yoshida of Hawaii and had 2 children, Janelle, who was 16, and Darian, age 10.
Gregory Jarvis was 42 years old. He was a payload specialist aboard this morning's shuttlecraft. He was born in August of 1944 in Detroit. He graduated from State University of New York at Buffalo with a degree in electrical engineering. He'd worked at Raytheon in Bedford, Massachusetts, designing circuits on missiles. Later, as a communications payload engineer in the Satellite Communications Program Office, Jarvis worked on advanced tactical communications satellites. He was again, on this Challenger mission, assigned the role of payload specialist.
36-year-old Ronald E Mcnair was doing research on lasers at the time he was selected to be an astronaut. Born and raised in Lake City, South Carolina, the Doctorate of Science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Joined the astronaut program in 1979, made his first space flight in 1984. Married to the former Cheryl Moore of Jamaica, New York, they had two children.
We have to interrupt Marianne for a second. We're going to return to Mission Control. NASA is providing us with more information on what is happening off Kennedy Space Center.
We're unable to get the rescue teams, the search and rescue teams, delayed in getting into the area because of debris continuing to fall from very high altitudes for as long almost as an hour after ascent. Those teams in place now in the search area. We will provide additional information as it becomes available to us. This is Mission Control, Houston.
We'd like to conclude our coverage of the 7 people, recalling who the 7 people aboard this morning's mission were and what their assignments were. Michael Smith, commander in the Navy, had the role of pilot on this Challenger launch. He was born in 1945 in Beaufort, North Carolina. He became a NASA astronaut in 1980. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy. He got an MS degree in aeronautical engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School. Smith flew A-6 intruders and also completed a Vietnam cruise assignment while assigned to attack squadron aboard the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier. He had been awarded the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 Air Medals, 13 Strike Flight Air Medals, and the Navy Commendation Medal with a V. That's the Navy Unit Citation and the Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star for his role in Vietnam. Michael Smith, the pilot of the Challenger.
The 7 crew members of this ill-fated Challenger mission. Krista McAuliffe, of course, was picked to be the first teacher in space some 6 months ago after a nationwide search. It was President Reagan's idea to put a private citizen in the shuttle program. Her husband, Stephen McAuliffe, talked to reporters shortly after the announcement that his wife was picked to be a primary candidate for the NASA Teacher in Space program.
I found out, honestly, nobody here believes this, but it's true. I found out on the radio, like everyone else.
Which station?
Oh, which station? GIR.
Chris, did he call you this morning at all?
No, I think she's paying me back for all the wise comments I've made in the last month or so.
Can you objectively say whether you had a feeling after, I think maybe premonitions might have been high, especially following the fact that she was the first one that NASA interviewed on Monday. Do you think there were any sneaking suspicious that sort of leaned her way?
No, not at all. I think everybody who knows her, I think, honestly thought that, there may have been candidates who were certainly her equal, but that there was nobody that would be superior to her. And we all felt that way, so we all felt that she had a really, really good chance. But obviously you can't say you knew she was going to win, or you knew she was going to be selected. And I wouldn't have been surprised if somebody else was selected because they were all so good.
You said, I guess early today, you were saying that you were the nervous wreck and she was the calm one. Is that in fact true? Was she really calm?
That is in fact true. She was very worried last night that Mike Callahan, my partner, and I were going to be total basket cases and unable to practice law for the next 10 years if she wasn't selected.
What were you doing when you heard it on the radio? Were you specifically listening for it, or were you just, was it on and then you heard it and you just said, oh, I can't?
Oh no, we turned it on because George Wilson of the Monitor thought he might be able to get an inside scoop on who the selectee was, and he was going to call me. And apparently they really put the silence on that in Washington, and his source wasn't able to produce. So he called me, and we called each other all morning saying, do you know, and not believing either one, I think.
You're looking forward to spending the rest of your life being known as the wife or the husband of the woman who went up in space?
Well, actually, I'm used to it. I've spent my entire married life being known as Krista's husband.
Are you prepared for what this means? I guess she's going to be home. She's going to be away for a year now, or come the flight. And
well, I don't imagine it's going to be a solid year away. I think it's. I mean, she'll be away for a long period of time, but I assume we'll be allowed to see her.
Are you ready to assume responsibility for the kids and the whole bit, and
I am.
the pressures that means on the home life?
I am very ready, willing, and able to turn those pressures over to my mother and my mother-in-law.
This isn't catching the shuttle to Boston. I mean, do you have
doing, but I mean, how can you as a human being turn down an opportunity like that? I certainly couldn't, and I wouldn't expect her to.
Are you asking NASA if they can make room for you too?
If there's a way to get on there, I'd like to hear about it.
Can I just go back to the kids? You know, they're young. Do you think this could have an effect on them to be gone, for long periods of time?
I don't think so. I mean, Scott's 8 and Caroline's 5, and Krista's always worked, and she's always made very strong efforts to, schedule time that solely belonged to them, and I don't see any reason why she wouldn't continue to do that. I mean, sure, there'll be 60 or 30-day periods where she won't be around, but if the last month or two is any indication, they can handle that fairly well. Especially when they see her on television every other night, they kind of enjoy that.
Have you talked to them yet?
I talked to Scott. Caroline's distracted at the swimming pool up at Concord Country Club, and Scott's at home fielding phone calls.
Are you aware of how excited the city as a whole is about this? I was just out on the street.
That's a great point, because that's one of the wonderful things I think about living in Concord, is that for the last, really since she applied, I think everybody has been so excited and has identified with her so well, and people in the street that or say we're rooting for, and you can see the anxiety in everybody's face, people that she works with and people that I work with, and just people that you see occasionally around town. We're really super, and I'm really happy for that. In fact, she was afraid last night when I was telling her the pressure of the city and the state are on her. And she said she didn't think she wanted to come back if she didn't get picked, that everybody would be downhearted. And I cleverly told her that was true, so she should keep that pressure in mind and do well.
Do you have specific plans in mind that you two talked about if she won? How you were going to work out some of the specifics of house care and...
Only one specific plan, and that is my VMI ring gets to go on the flight.
VMI? What does that stand for?
What does that stand for? That's the best military school in the United States, Virginia Military Institute.
Do you have anything as the husband of the first woman who's...
I'm laughing because one of my colleagues here went to West Point. He disputes that rather hotly.
Do you have...
But he isn't being interviewed. So.
If it was you going instead, or during the talks that you've had with your wife, has there been any, point of view that you've had, any type of thing you want her to tell people, or any special interest you have in the space program, or what she's doing?
I don't understand the question.
Has there been a specific thing about it that's really excited you?
Oh, sure. I mean, the idea of floating above the Earth free of gravity, my God, yeah, that's, to me, that's unbelievable.
That, of course, was an interview earlier with the husband of Krista McAuliffe, who was one of the 7 crew aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded at 11:38 this morning, shortly after liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center. It is considered extremely doubtful that the accident was survivable. It is feared that America has lost all 7 of its astronauts, 2 women, a black man, and the other white males who were aboard this mission's flight. It was 19 years ago yesterday that America suffered its worst fatality. It has had, until today, no fatalities in actual space flight. But that was the fire aboard the Apollo Saturn 201, which was the 27th of January 1967, which Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives. That wasn't a flight, that was just a test interiorly of the Apollo spacecraft itself. Those men were killed by fire and fumes without ever having left the pad. As we saw this morning, Challenger did make it a minute 15 seconds into its flight and was some 10.5 miles altitude by the time the explosion overtook it. The Soviets have had differing luck with their space flights. They have lost 3 men on re-entry once when they had a defection in the re-entry vehicle itself, a pressure problem, really probably human error. They failed to close a valve properly. They also lost a man whose returning spacecraft, Komarov, who got tangled in his parachutes coming down. Those are the fatalities the Soviets have mentioned. They've had other close calls, as have we. Nothing, however, like 7 people aboard one craft, because nothing except the space shuttle is capable of carrying 7 people aboard one spacecraft. As we know, as aircraft got bigger, the potential for disaster among them got greater as well. We have seen the sea, which now in the afternoon off the coast of Florida remains serene, strange, as recovery crews attempt to ply it. The wreckage should be some 8 miles offshore if it came straight down. It had tremendous forward as well as upward velocity, however. The craft was at that altitude flying about Mach 3, about 3 times the speed of sound, some 2,000 miles per hour as we count them here on Earth. The velocity would have thrust it up and onward considerably beyond the 10 miles up and the 8 miles out. That's the situation. As we say, we have not had, until this day at any rate, any fatalities in the short history of space flight. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space for the Soviets, died much, much later in a simple plane crash east of Moscow. Let's go back now to Atlanta. Lois Hart.
Thank you, Reed. H.B. Armitage is with me. He is Director of Flight Operations at Georgia Tech. Thank you for joining us today. As you watched what happened today, I know you were a friend of the commander, Dick Scobie. You must have been horrified.
Absolutely. It was a very terrible experience to know something like this was happening. It's a terrible disaster.
And yet there's no doubt in your mind that the program must go on.
Oh, absolutely. Just like we have airplanes that occasionally explode, like we have a furnace in homes that explode when you have the right combination of fuel, air, and a spark. This can happen in the most sophisticated of equipment ever built. It appears that maybe something of this nature is what happened today.
Yes, astronaut Eugene Cernan has speculated that the containers separating the two kinds of fuels that are used ruptured, causing the explosion. Does that sound right to you?
That's a possibility, yes. But we have no information at this point to really verify anything.
He also says there is a procedure for the shuttle to separate from the boosters once there is a crisis, but there wasn't enough time in this case. Can you explain how that works?
Well, I can't explain the exact details of the separation, but whenever you have something as large as the shuttle, it takes, because of the inertia effect, it takes time for the shuttle to separate from the booster packages, or the booster packages separate from the shuttle. And this cannot be done in a matter of an instant. And frequently, when you have an explosion of this type, the crew may have only had 1 or 2 seconds notification that this was about to happen, and you just can't react that fast.
So you're saying that given enough warning, it could have been maneuvered away. How much warning?
That's difficult to answer also. Yes, if given enough warning, is a strong probability that the boosters and the shuttle could have separated and not caused, if that's what caused this one.
Does it bother you that there was a delay this morning that had to do with a fire alarm?
It's very difficult at this point to say that that had anything to do with it. In fact, we would all be just guessing at this point. Anytime you have mechanical problems, sure, it bothers us, whether it's an airplane or shuttle or whatever. But at this point, I think it's way too early to speculate.
And the cold weather. This is something new for NASA, too, isn't it?
Yes, but I don't think the cold weather really had anything to do with this type of thing.
Will we ever know what happened? Is there the equivalent of a black box on a shuttle?
Oh, yes. And I think, without a doubt,
they probably will know in time, but it will take considerable investigation, it will take time, and it will take a lot of development and a lot of work to determine just what happened.
H.B. Armitage from Georgia Tech, thank you for joining us. And we return now to Tom and Tyr in our continuing live coverage of today's shuttle disaster. Tom?
Thank you, Lois. The picture you see behind me is off the shore of the Kennedy Space Center. As search efforts are underway, they did not start for 55 minutes after the explosion because NASA says continuing debris was falling, making it impossible to move those rescue efforts into the area. We have seen a Coast Guard cutter moving across the shore about a half hour ago, but not heading in the direction of space. Let's now go to Utah Senator Jake Garn in Washington.
We have Senator Garn, who is being placed behind the microphones, Tom, in the Senate gallery. Senator, can you hear me this morning yet, sir?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system. And I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids, and so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, what was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter. Yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and that this not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky do you feel today that you returned safely?
That's Senator Jake Garn, who's been recalling his mission and commenting on this morning's tragedy over the Kennedy Space Center, the explosion in mid-flight of the Challenger. Senator Garn, as you know, was America's first senator in space, having flown aboard Discovery in April of 1985. And the senator is recounting his flight and discussing what was happening to him and his feelings about things. Tom and Tier again in Atlanta.
Read, the picture you're seeing behind me is the seas off the shores of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the rescue efforts have been going on now for well over an hour. It took almost 1 hour before they could bring those crews into the area because for that time period, the debris from the exploded shuttle was still falling. CNN's John Zarella is at the Kennedy Space Center and maybe has an update for us. John?
Tom, as you just said, it was falling for about an hour after the explosion. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Department of Defense just told us that debris was falling from at least 50,000 feet, and that he doubted that that was the top altitude where debris was falling from. It was the range safety officer who was in charge, who through radar and monitoring this falling debris made the determination not to allow recovery ships and vehicles into the area until they were sure that all the debris had finally fallen into the water. At the present time, there are 2 H-3 helicopters now being handled by the Department of Defense with the the chief man in charge of the operation on board one of those helicopters. I do not have his name. There is the one C-130 aircraft in the area. There is one SRB recovery ship. Of course, that is the ship that would recover those solid rocket boosters once they have fallen back into the water. There is one Coast Guard hydrofoil on the scene. 2 more H-3 helicopters, Coast Guard helicopters out of Clearwater, Florida, are on their way to the scene, and one Coast Guard cutter from Grand Bahama is making its way at top speed to the rescue, to the recovery area. At this point, again, they have had no word, according to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson, from the recovery scene as to what, if anything, they have found there. He says that it may be another hour before they have any more information from the recovery scene, from those ships and helicopters that are in the area right now. Tom?
John, is there any indication that Challenger was veering off course? It was very difficult to tell from the picture here, but you were there. Are you hearing anything about the possibility that it was heading off course and maybe going back over toward inhabited land areas?
Nothing at all, Tom. I was standing right out on the edge of the water looking out at the launch pad, and of course, when it took off on that trajectory, it seemed to be making a perfect ascent right up until the moment of the explosion. And there's been so much speculation in the past hour and 36 minutes. The clock's still running on out on the pad. That perhaps at throttle back, that the SRBs, they went up to 204%, suddenly increasing in the velocity of the SRBs, and of course that the shuttle cannot handle that. But that is just all such speculation at this point, and that they couldn't throttle them back. But again, so much speculation here as to what may or may not have happened. The one thing that everybody is certain of at this point is that after that explosion, another piece of the shuttle, whatever it might have been, whether it was a rocket or whether it was the orbiter itself, continued on for some time apparently, and no one, of course, knows what happened at that point. At least no one is saying. But again, all right, it's going to be about an hour, Tom.
All right, John, we'll wait for word back from you from the Kennedy Space Center. For those of you who may have just joined us, tragedy in the skies over Florida this morning at 11:39 a.m., 1 minute after liftoff. Challenger exploded in a ball of fire. There appears to have killed all 7 crew members, including the first private citizen in space, school teacher Christy McAuliffe.
7, 6.
This is a replay of the launch of Challenger, main engines igniting and lifting away from pad 39B, the first time that pad had been used in 10 years since the Apollo program. The second pad would have allowed NASA to keep its ambitious schedule of 15 launches this year.
Confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
The large brown object you see in the center of your screen is the external tank which holds the volatile fuel.
Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
The white tubes are the solid rocket boosters, one on each side of that brown tank.
Shortly.
And the shuttle in this position sits below it.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
When the explosion occurred, everything seemed to be attached. The solid rockets were not scheduled to separate for several more minutes.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
That's the last words.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The twin contrails of white smoke going away from the huge fireball. The solid rocket continuing to burn as it heads toward the landing point in the ocean. Here's a slow motion replay. Now you see fire right between the space shuttle and the external tank. There are no engines there. No reason for fire to be there. And then it explodes. Shuttle still visible. Now it's gone. There were spectators watching at the Kennedy Space Center at the time, taking photographs. In this picture you're about to see here now, no indication of any problem. This is probably about 30 seconds into the flight. Krista McCullough's school children. You hear the yell of anticipation, the glee, the happiness that would soon change. The cries of, oh no. There you see Krista McCullough's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, from Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch. At this point, no one really realized what had happened, just that there was a large puff of white smoke and an explosion in the sky. Those who had never witnessed a launch before probably not realizing a NASA official climbed a couple of rows into the bleachers to where Krista McCullough's parents were standing, walked up and said to them, "The vehicle has exploded." A stunned Mrs. Corrigan looked back at them and repeated the words as a question. "The vehicle has exploded." He nodded silently, and then the realization of what had happened swept across Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan's face. Disbelief at first. Krista McCullough's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, watching as Challenger was in flight for 1 minute and then exploded in a huge fireball. It appears that there were no survivors. Let's go now to Washington and Reed Collins.
Thank you, Tom. TASS has mentioned the tragedy, saying that the Challenger has exploded on takeoff, just a brief line from the Soviet Union. Let's get back to the White House now. Charles Beerbaugh perhaps can fill us in on more of what the president is saying, doing, and thinking in this hour. Charles?
Reed, we had a chance to talk with the president, a few of us, a few moments ago. He described this as a very traumatic experience for him as well as for the nation. He indeed described the astronauts themselves as pioneers and said that there have always been hazards and people have always died on the frontier, that is part of the nature of pioneering. The president watched a replay of the explosion in the study next to his Oval Office just moments after it had happened, and he'd been notified of it. He called it a horrible thing. He said, "I can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice made by these astronauts and made by their families." Going on to note that of course included Krista McCullough, whose family had, even in the White House in the Roosevelt Room a few feet from where the president was standing, been named as that Teacher in Space program which the president himself had instituted and had fostered. He said he wished that there was something that he and the nation could do to relieve the sense of loss for the families. The president went on to talk about the safety record of the American space program. He said that "I am confident that there would be no flight till they," meaning the NASA folks, "are certain that it's safe." He remarked that this was indeed the first fatality in space that the American program has had. He said, too, that he's been so confident and now he feels so shocked. We asked the president how he felt about having the teacher, a citizen other than a regular astronaut, go up there. His remark on that was that this is what the space program is about. And to the children around the country who have watched so closely the development of Krista McCullough as an astronaut and the launch into space, he said that the children must learn, that must be made clear that life goes on. The president had, in fact, been anticipating a briefing, a background session on his State of the Union address tonight. He said, of course, that the State of the Union address will be given, that there will be mention made of the tragedy of the Space Shuttle. And he went on to say, but we can't stop the space program. We will continue. So indeed, Reed, the president very much shocked. The agony of this experience very visible on his face, his voice very soft and very disturbed by what has happened here. Reed?
Thank you, Charles Beerbaugh, reporting live on the president's reaction to what has happened at the Kennedy Space Center scarcely a couple of hours ago. Mary Alice?
Thank you, Reed. With us here in New York is Dr. Robert Jastrow, who was founder and the first director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He was also first chairman of NASA's Lunar Exploration Committee. Dr. Well, you have not been directly involved in the shuttle program. You've watched it carefully for its scientific and commercial applications. It's been fraught with problems lately, mechanical and electronic, but never with tragedy before.
I think it's all so terrible, it's difficult to give a collected judgment, but I think the first thing one has to do is look back over the record of the program, which is now almost 25 years old in manned flight, and has had just two serious accidents. One was 19 years ago, almost to the date, and now there's this one.
A fire on the launch pad, that's right.
I think the record is as good as the human brain can make it, and you have to remember that these men and women have a risk which is about the same as that of a military test pilot. It's a dangerous job, and it should never be thought otherwise. I think the other point, please go ahead.
I was going to say, this is going to stop flights for a while, one presumes, until everyone finds out what on earth went wrong. Why do we need to continue a manned space program? Or do we?
That's the second and the larger point. If some of my scientist friends say we only need unmanned vehicles, then the shuttle is not needed. But I think they're quite wrong. You need manned flight because we are going to put up into space satellites that cost as much as $1 billion. We're putting one up next year, and later this year, to look into the beginning of the universe and out to the edge of space. And at $1 billion, they can't be thrown away. They've got to be maintained and fixed by man in orbit. And on the commercial side, where we get our dollar and cents return from these investments, you've got to have men up there, the brain behind the eyeball, to fix these automated factories that we hope to put into space and make sure the product keeps flowing. It just is necessary to carry through this pioneering effort until it becomes routine.
As a physicist and scientist who's watched this program very carefully, what is your view of the shuttle's ambitious schedule this year?
Well, I thought it was a reasonable schedule. It's a little more than one a month, and there's no indication that the schedule was responsible for this defect. I don't know what the cause was, but I think that we can look forward to monthly and then bi-weekly and then even more frequent launches. We just must push ahead if it is important to have man in space, and it seems to me and to most people that it is.
I'm going to ask you to speculate because it's something that none of us can tell right now, but you've been in mission control before. There are computers in there that give practically instantaneous readouts of what's happening inside that shuttle. How fast would those computers be able to generate information on what happened this morning?
You know,
in
Mary,
an uncontrolled, controlled explosion, which is what happened.
Yes, you have to be right on top of it to answer that question. Whether all the data came in or some vital piece of information was missing in the explosion itself is something I don't know. Only the people who are on top of it know, and only they can tell how long it will take to put the story together.
Talk to me a little bit about the training that these people go through. You heard Senator Jake Garn just moments ago talking about his training. It sounds like military test pilot training.
Well, it is, and as I mentioned, the fatalities, the risk is about the same as that of a military test pilot. They're important jobs, they're dangerous jobs, and the men and women who lay their lives on the line know that, and they do something that the nation is grateful to them for. It's terrible in an extra dimension that a school teacher, a wife, and a mother was also on board. But as the president said just recently, the purpose of the whole program is to make this flight routine. And
available to civilians.
Yes, because it will not be trained military test pilots and professional astronauts who will be fixing those factories and fixing those telescopes and those scientific platforms. We must overcome this pioneering difficulty and pass into a time when a shuttle flight doesn't even get on the pages of the newspaper.
You had not seen that, the replay of what happened this morning before you were sitting with me, and you had a very tough time looking at it.
Indeed, well, it's just too terrible. And if you were closer to it, it would be worse yet. But I must repeat again that, you know, if there is a purpose to man in space, and there is, we need him, for science and for the dollar and cents return on the program, then the shuttle is the way to go. And we must persist.
I want to go back to a very specific point. Again, I don't know if you can answer this because of your lack of direct involvement in the shuttle flight. This is the first shuttle in which, as far as we know, in which there were no ejection seats. Now, whether or not an ejection seat would have helped save the lives up there is obviously debatable.
I'm not informed well enough to say, but it looked to me as though the end was instantaneous in just viewing the tape of that explosion.
Okay, Dr. Robert Jastrow of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, thanks for being with us. We're going now to Dave Walker.
We will join Dave shortly, Mary Alice, with more information and background on what has happened today. First, Concord, New Hampshire, of course, the town from which the first school teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, came, is stunned today. Reporter Howard Nielsen is at Concord, New Hampshire High School, where Krista McAuliffe taught and where they were watching this morning. Howard.
Yes, it's a state of shock here. The students at Concord High School were in a cafeteria watching the shoot live through a satellite arrangement with public broadcasting. There was a lot of joy, a lot of excitement, noisemakers, cheering, yelling as the liftoff went. At first, it was not apparent what had happened. Nobody could quite understand it. And then, all of a sudden, one of the officials of the school realized that there had been this tragic event. He ordered the television monitor turned off, asked that everyone quiet down. Then it settled in. People realized what had happened. There was silence. And then students began crying. The news media, who had been in the cafeteria prepared to cover this event, were asked to leave the school. They did. The students then went to their individual classrooms. The administration officials went to the administrative offices to determine what to do. There was some brief counseling of students by teachers, and then the students were released to go home to their parents. We understand that there is a possibility of a news conference sometime around 3 o'clock this afternoon. Back to you.
Howard, I missed just a portion of what you said there, some activity here. Did you say the students are being sent home or that considerations being given to that?
The students have been sent home.
All right, thank you. Reporter Howard Nielsen at Concord, New Hampshire High School, a high school located in a city of about 30,000 people, the city that was home for crew member Krista McAuliffe. Joining us right now is Dave Walker with more information and some personal observations on space shuttle launches. Dave?
Thanks, Bob. And having observed numerous launches at the Kennedy Space Center over the years, the personal experience is awe-inspiring, as you might expect, and particularly when you view it for the very first time, you actually feel the impact of the combustion of the rockets. You see the fire developing underneath as you observe this from about 5 miles away. And then, at the speed of sound, of course, you can begin to feel the impact. It's a popping noise, and there's a lot of palmetto around, or at least there used to be, the Kennedy Space Center. You can hear that begin to rattle. You can hear birds flying off, and there used to even be some rattlesnakes and alligators. They would become agitated themselves. This is generally what it looks like. Not having observed a shuttle launch, I've observed several of the Apollo missions, but the force that is created here is enormous. And as I said, once again, when you're at the viewing center, the VIP stand or the press stand, you don't hear anything at first. You just see this huge fireball. And then a few moments later, you begin to hear a popping noise. And of course, everybody on the viewing stand, including the news media, as has become custom, begins cheering, applauding, saying, "Go, go." It is indeed one of the most startling experiences of my lifetime as a reporter. And, of course, today's developments draw attention as we try to possibly understand what happened. With us now is Professor Ben T. Zinn. He is Professor of Aerospace Engineering at Georgia Tech University. And, Professor, as you look at this, you can see a little bit of burning here on the propellant booster of the shuttle, and then you see the massive explosion. I know you have done some research into solid boosters. As you look at that, what would you speculate might have happened?
It looks like an explosion to me, and there's a phenomenon known as combustion instability, which often occurs in both solid and liquid propellant rocket motors. And if I had to make a guess at this time based on limited amount of information, I would guess that an instability occurred in the solid booster and caused the explosion.
So an instability in the solid booster in some form or fashion somehow ignited the enormous booster which is carried underneath the shuttle, causing the massive explosion. And you were telling me earlier that they have had some problems with those solid boosters. What sort of problems have they encountered?
Well, normally when we have a combustion instability, what happens is the pressure inside the solid propellant does not follow the pre-designed pressure time history. And
in other words, it has to burn at a certain rate.
It has to burn at a certain rate, and when an instability occurs, we obtain pressure oscillations. You can think of the booster as if it is an organ pipe in which a solid propellant is burning. And the instability is a disturbance, and it disturbs the...
Now, those are the solid boosters we want to point out to our viewers on either side of the liquid booster underneath the shuttle.
Well, if you see the end of on the two sides, you see the two ends of the solid boosters, and you can think of them as two organ pipes which are loaded with solid propellant. And when an instability occurs, you'll obtain longitudinal oscillations along the booster, pressure oscillations or pressure waves which are running back and forth, and they interfere with the burning process. They can cause acceleration of the burning process. They can result in extreme buildup of pressures, abnormal burning of the solid propellant, and eventually an explosion. If the casing is not strong enough to withstand the sufficiently large pressures which can build inside, the whole thing can explode. And maybe this would happen.
So these oscillations, as you described them, they run up and down the length of the solid booster itself, causing the booster itself to become destabilized in some form or fashion.
Well, basically, they destabilize the burning process of the solid propellant.
And once that happens, if a problem does develop, then this entire mass of solid fuel, which is not burned off, can explode like a firecracker?
It does not have to, but it can. Not every time you have an instability, it may lead to an explosion. And there are known solid boosters which have what we call slight instabilities in them, yet they are operational and there are no problems. But under some conditions, if there was some another defect, an instability can conceivably lead to such an explosion.
What had you learned? What sort of problems was NASA encountering? That oscillation problem you mentioned on the outset here?
I'm not sure. I know that at least I've heard that at least in the development stages of those boosters, they have experienced some instabilities.
So there have been problems which we had not necessarily heard about, and you also go ahead.
We have not heard about them, but NASA knows about them, and the other people know about them, and they've been working on them. It's not that we have had a problem and it was left unattended to. This problem has been worked on, and I'm sure that if they decided to attach this booster to the shuttle, then they felt that the problem has been taken care of.
One more question. Is solid fuel or the hypergolic fuels, is one more safe than the other?
You cannot say. It depends on the circumstances, depends on the design of the rocket motor. You really cannot make a general
One scenario is possible. They could have encountered a problem aboard one or both of the solid booster rockets, which could have ignited in some way the liquid booster container.
Only after the explosion. You know what? As long as the combustion is contained within the casing of the solid booster.
But we saw some tape right after the initial explosion there of at least one of the boosters still, or possibly two, still going on their course. What would that indicate to you?
I suspect that instability occurred in one of the boosters, not in both of them. And once it's exploded, and there was so much fuel on board in the liquid rocket and in the other solid booster that they just joined. Maybe the first explosion could have triggered the others to explode. But I suspect that one of them had some defect in it, something happened, it may have gone unstable, exploded, and then the rest of the Challenger, just exploded also.
Professor Zinn, thank you for joining us today from Georgia Tech University.
Thank you.
And we continue our live coverage. Marianne?
Thank you, Dave. As you know, at this point in time, the first participant in the Teacher in Space program, Sharon Krista McAuliffe, a 27-year-old social studies teacher from Concord High School in New Hampshire, was one of the crew members aboard this flight. And joining us now from Concord, New Hampshire, is one of her students, Mark Latalian. Thank you for being with us this afternoon on what must be a very, very difficult day for you. Mark, can you explain to us exactly what it was like when you and the other students were watching what happened on television?
Well, we were just shocked that it happened. Nobody even knew what was going on. I mean, we were just so surprised. I don't even think it's hit everybody yet.
What was the first reaction from you and your fellow students when you realized that indeed there was a disaster taking place and not an exciting, perfect mission and liftoff as we had first thought?
Well, we were really quiet. We didn't say anything, you know. We sat around for a couple of minutes and they told us to go back to our classrooms, but we were just stunned.
Are you at home now, Mark? We understand that the students were sent home from school. Can you tell us something about your teacher, Krista McAuliffe?
Well, she wasn't my teacher, but I knew her, and she, you know, she seemed pretty nice, and I feel, you know, bad about that happened.
Did you? I'm sorry, Mark, can you speak up?
Well, she wasn't I didn't have her in any classes, but I knew she was. She was, you know, a nice person. I think that it was good that she won the candidacy, but I can just say, you know, now that I feel bad for her husband and her kid.
All right, thank you. Mark Latalian of Concord High School, one of the students who knew one of the astronauts aboard the Challenger today, Krista McAuliffe of Concord High School in New Hampshire. Tom?
For those of you who may be just joining us, tragedy strikes NASA. 7 astronauts, including the first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, were apparently killed 1 minute after liftoff this morning from the Kennedy Space Center. Let's go back now to the Shuttle Challenger on the launch pad. Launch pad 39B, the first time this had been used for 10 years. It was last used in the Apollo program, but NASA redesigned and refitted this launch pad to allow the shuttle to launch from here, to give them 2 launch pads at the Kennedy Space Center.
9, 8.
Just a few seconds, you'll see the shuttle's 3 main engines fire up and start. Everything appeared to look normal.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
The shuttle has completed its roll procedure here.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
The brown
94%.
object you see in the center is the external tank that contains the highly volatile fuel, 2 solid rockets which propel the shuttle to its orbit on both sides of that tank.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Because the shuttle goes through its most stress, they keep the engines down to 65%.
Downrange distance, 3 nautical miles.
The 2 solid rockets were not supposed to leave the side of the external tank, and the external tank separation for another 7 minutes after the disaster occurred. This is where they throttle up, and the last words from the shuttle. It explodes in a huge fireball, one of the solid rockets veering to the right, another going to the left. Through the flame that's still burning there and the cloud, you could not see anything left of the shuttle. Let's go. We have a cutaway drawing here that I'd like to show you. There are contingencies just in case the shuttle careens out of control. NASA has 2 areas on the external tank that contain explosive charges. This is an option on every launch that they have. Not saying that it was used this time, but it exists, that if the shuttle would careen over a populated area, the range officer at Cape Canaveral Air Force Base, just down the coast, carefully monitors the shuttle's ascent, and should a point of impact where the spacecraft should suddenly fall, at the fingertips is a switch that would send an encrypted signal to start the detonation. We're not saying that this did occur, but it is one of the contingencies that will be investigated, I'm sure, as they look into this tragedy that struck the NASA shuttle program, and we've lost 7 of America's astronauts. Reed?
Tom, Senator John Glenn, the first American in orbit, now a senator from the state of Ohio, is about to tell us his feelings from the Senate gallery.
And it finally has arrived. We hoped we could push this day back forever. But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So today we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow-motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, you know, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. And it's been an amazingly successful program so far. You know, I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? Well, we'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They've run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. And it's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, you know, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence, there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ned White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this, since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
A loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
Well, how much does it set back the citizen in space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
That is Senator John Glenn, the Democrat of Ohio, America's first man in orbit, expressing his sentiments on this morning's tragedy with the 7 aboard Challenger that exploded soon after takeoff. Bob?
Thank you, Reed. If, as is feared, none aboard the Shuttle Challenger survived today's disaster, 7 American space pioneers lost their lives. The commander of this mission was Francis R. Scobie, known as Dick Scobie. He was 47 years old, born in Cle Elum, Washington. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Scobie was pilot of the Challenger mission in 1984, during which the crew retrieved, repaired aboard the Challenger, and returned to orbit the ailing Solar Maximum mission satellite. He was the commander of this mission.
36-year-old Judith Resnik was one of 3 mission specialists aboard this flight. From Akron, Ohio, a degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD from the University of Maryland. During a her mission on an earlier shuttle flight on her first trip. The crew successfully deployed 3 satellites. She had logged 144 hours, nearly 145 hours of space flight.
Krista McAuliffe was 37 years old. She was born in Boston, got her BA degree from Framingham State College in Massachusetts, later a master's degree in education. She had taught English and American history since 1970, selected as the first teacher in space in July of last year.
Ellison S. Hanazuka was also aboard the Challenger today, an aerospace flight test engineer with the McClellan Air Force Base, a mission specialist with the, also participated in the first Department of Defense secret shuttle mission.
Gregory Jarvis was 42 years old. He was one of the other payload specialists aboard this Challenger mission. He had worked at Raytheon in Bedford, Massachusetts, and had been an integration manager for other spacecraft programs since 1983.
36-year-old Ronald E Mcnair is a PhD. He was also a mission specialist. He was an astronaut since 1978 from Lake City, South Carolina, and graduated from North Carolina A&T State University and had a PhD in physics.
And finally, Michael Smith. He was 41. He was a very highly decorated U.S. Navy pilot, a veteran of Vietnam combat, had flown over 4,300 hours, including 4,000 of them in jet aircraft. He was pilot of this Challenger mission.
CNN has been informed that Donald Regan has asked the Speaker of the House to postpone tonight's scheduled State of the Union address. Let's go to Mr. Speaks in the briefing room.
Scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the Space Shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until, and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the Space Shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the president believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the president also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The president will, will for the balance of the week, continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry,
Larry, can you
Let's
tell
go
us,
one at a time.
the president have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, there, you know, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression on the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the President, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone. Larry,
can you tell us what information the President is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the President has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
Well, I was going to go back again on where the idea of postponing the speech first initiated. Did the President initiate the idea?
The President initiated the idea of postponing the speech.
Larry, will the shuttle program be suspended at least until the investigation is through?
Those determinations have not been made. The President indicated to Bill Graham that he should find out the cause of it and then proceed. Now, exactly how that dovetails with future flights will just have to be determined as a result of what NASA determines in their investigation.
On the consideration of whether any civilians will be permitted to continue on shuttle flights, is that also part of the investigation?
Well, to echo the President's words that all of these people were Americans. They were all interested in space. They all came first with courage, and second in a spirit of volunteering for this mission. And whether there'll be any change in that, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think there's any inclination. Joe?
Has the President attempted to contact the family members of anyone who was on the shuttle?
The President has not yet done that, no, except to send the Vice President in expression of his concern.
Is there any feeling here that NASA was pushing too hard? There was a very ambitious program. Was it 15 launches for this year?
I think NASA has a very good record of safety and a very cautious human approach to space exploration, and they have taken those precautions. This is a tragedy of major proportions and one that concerns us all. But for the moment, there is no finger pointing at NASA as far as their safety record.
If I may, the question arises particularly because in recent launches there have been some glitches that have come up. As you know, they had a problem with the door, the hatch on this, and the drill wouldn't work and all of that. Does that not give the impression that they may be pushing too fast?
I can't make that judgment from here, but I think if you would look back at other space launches in the Mercury and Apollo program, you would find that there have been postponements. These not because of glitches, but because of an extensive safety program that finds these glitches before launch.
Can you be more specific about what the Vice President will be doing later today specifically, and also the postponement on the State of the Union pushed back the schedule for the budget and other things that were scheduled for next week?
The Vice President's schedule, once he arrives at the Cape, has not been determined, since it's just within the last few moments that the President has asked him to go down.
Well, what's his specific charge? I mean, when
his specific charge, once again, is to express the President's concern to the families and to accompany the director of NASA down to the Cape in order to see that the President's directions for an immediate look into the tragedy, into the explosion, is accomplished.
Is he viewed as he overseeing an investigation into this?
I don't think that you can say that yet, Norm. I think this matter is entirely in the hands of the NASA people at the present time, and I don't know of any. There's no further planning beyond that. Question on the budget, that has not been determined. It would be my inclination to say that the budget will probably go up on Wednesday, with the State of the Union on Tuesday. I think the Graham-Rudman law requires that it go up by February 5th, and that they will do. Andrew, and then I'm going to go all the way to the back and work forward.
I just want to follow on Norm. Is it the President's view that perhaps an independent investigation outside of NASA is what is required on the pacing of the program? And
I think everyone is leapfrogging well ahead of events at present. This tragedy is now only hours old. You have a series of actions taken by the President, including a charge to the director of NASA to find out what happened. And until we do some preliminary studies, none of these questions have answers. So, Pat?
Has the decision been made to have the President officially disclose tonight in his speech what happened, or will we continue to get details from NASA throughout the day, or are they going to hold the President's speech?
NASA will continue to keep you abreast of everything as they know it, as they always have through the entire history of the American space program. So, John?
Larry, you made a point of saying early on that there would be no greater way to honor those who apparently have died in this mission than to continue on with the space program. Is this a deliberate effort to try to counteract any feelings against the program because of the tragedy?
John, the only deliberate effort we're making at the moment is to show our deep concern, our deep emotion, and our desire that America continue in the space program. That's our entire motive, lock, stock, and barrel. Joanna?
Larry, has the President expressed any rue or regret about his proposal to send civilians in space?
The President is obviously concerned about every person that he, as the chief executive officer of the government, he as the President directs. He directs people every day, either directly or indirectly, to conduct missions on the part of the government, the military, NASA, and those. It's a fact of life when the man sits in the Oval Office. He has to make these decisions. And I have not heard him express any regret. Concern, yes. Deep emotion, yes. Sorrow, yes. But regret is not that. It was the decision made, as he said, these individuals are all Americans, and they're all believers in the space program, and that's what's in his mind. So, Walter?
Larry, does the President plan today to speak with any of the relatives, family of any of the...
That hasn't been determined yet, no. Frank?
Can you give us any indication as to what the First Lady was doing at the time that this information became available and what her reaction was?
I don't. We can check with her office, if you will, and see what we can get.
Because the Europeans are able to put up satellites in with unmanned vehicles, doesn't this accident argue per se that unmanned vehicles are a preferable way to put up satellites in orbit?
Once again, you know, I have been a silent observer of the space program and not one that's actively involved, and I'm not competent to answer that.
As you recall, the President made the decision to send a teacher into space. Can you tell us on what he based that decision and who suggested the timing and when the time was right for that mission?
Well, Mike, I don't want to come down hard on you, but what's in the President's mind right now is to find out what happened and to show those families of those people that he's concerned. And that's all that's on his mind at the moment.
Are you operating on the assumption that this is the result of some technological problem, or has anyone suggested the possibility it might be an act of terrorism?
There have been no suggestions either way.
Thank you.
This was, of course, this disastrous accident this morning, the first in-air disaster or fatal accident that NASA has experienced. It's the only other time when astronauts have been killed as part of a space program was actually on the ground back in 1967 on a launch pad explosion as part of the Apollo program. 3 astronauts died in that accident after 16 previous successful missions. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Grissom, Lieutenant Colonel Edward White, and Lieutenant Commander Roger Chaffee were all killed on Apollo flight. It was Flight 204. One of the people who witnessed that and was taking careful notice of same is Robert Wussler, who is an executive here with Turner Broadcasting and working for a former network, another network formerly. In January of 1967 was the executive producer of special events and was covering this as it happened. Can you tell us the reaction at the time back in 1967 to the tragedy?
Well, Marianne, it was a different time, it was a different age. The individual astronauts, there were only 15 or 18 at the time, active astronauts, the original 7 of whom 2 were not flying at the time, and a second class of, I believe, about 12, from which Roger Chaffee and Ed White had come from. The public was much more familiar with them. It was truly, there's a good picture of Gus Grissom right now. Ed White, the first man to walk in space for this country. Roger Chaffee right there, the rookie on the flight. Scenes of their memorable funeral procession in Washington and at Arlington National Cemetery. Scenes that I remember quite well. A different time because the individual astronauts were known so much better than, of course, the astronauts of today. There were fewer of them, there were fewer flights. Each one was a major newsworthy event of its time. The news of the accident on the pad at Cape Canaveral on that historic Friday, last week in January, almost the same date of today, 19 years ago, spread like wildfire among the news media throughout Cocoa Beach, Florida, Cape Canaveral, and the New York network news centers. At that time, in the NASA space program, there was very heavy security throughout the Cape Canaveral Center, Cape Kennedy, and there were no newsmen on the Cape at the time of the accident. The accident took place about 6:30 at night. We began to hear that there were problems sometime around 7 o'clock or 7:30, and it was not until about 8 p.m. at night that NASA finally made an announcement that there had been an accident. To the best of our knowledge, the 3 astronauts at the time were killed instantly. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was taken to the pad area about 7 days after the accident, and it is still one of the more horrific memories of my days as a newsman.
We have been getting to know all through this morning and early this afternoon the 7 crew members aboard the Challenger who are believed to have been killed in this terrible accident. Can you tell us something about these three astronauts
Well, of course,
who were the first to be killed in it?
Certainly. I think Gus Grissom was well portrayed in the motion picture The Right Stuff, which was, of course, about the lives of the 7 original astronauts, the Mercury astronauts, as they were referred to, the famous Life magazine photograph when they were announced back in the late 50s, and their progress towards a manned launching in 1961. Alan Shepard was our first astronaut in space for the United States, that having come on May the 3rd, 1951. Gus Grissom was our second astronaut. He went into space, I believe the date was a mid-July date in 1961. He had some problems on that flight. A spacecraft problem happened after his suborbital flight, and a helicopter came along to pick he and his capsule up. It flooded with water, the capsule was lost, Grissom was saved, and there were investigations after the fact as to exactly what happened. Nothing was ever proven or disproven with regard to why that capsule was lost. Ed White, a very popular astronaut, our first walker in space on a Gemini flight in June of 1965. And Roger Chaffee, regarded to be one of the brightest of the young astronauts. There was probably a very good chance that those 2 astronauts would have gone to the moon, certainly on Apollo 11, our first flight, or shortly thereafter. 3 very popular astronauts. It delayed the space program at the time for some 12 or 18 months until we finally got back on the road in 1968, and culminating with a successful lunar landing in July of 1969.
And again, NASA's saying today that it could be months before another space shuttle will be able to be launched because of, until they figure out exactly what happened.
Well, certainly it's going to take a long time to investigate the difficulties of today.
Thank you very much, Robert Wessler, who was the executive producer of special events for CBS when the accident occurred, killing our astronauts in 1967. Bob?
Marianne, among the people watching the launch, preparations for it, and then the launch itself at Kennedy Space Center this morning, first with tremendous pride and excitement, and then in absolute disbelieving horror, were Mr. and Mrs. Edward Corrigan, Edward and Grace Corrigan, the parents of Krista Corrigan McAuliffe, who was just about to become this country's and the world's first teacher in space. It was just last month that Mr. and Mrs. Corrigan spoke with our correspondent, Tony Clark.
What was it like when Krista was selected? How'd you all feel?
Great.
Excited. Very excited. You all going to be at the Cape?
Naturally, wouldn't miss it.
Yes, the whole family will be there. We have 4 other children besides Krista, so everybody will be there. Is this really like her? I mean,
Absolutely.
No change. Do this one at a time. Ms. Corrigan, did it surprise you first that she would try to be an astronaut and then be selected?
No on both. I know an awful lot of luck was involved in it, but I'm not surprised because I knew she'd do a good job if she were chosen, and I'm just so pleased that she was chosen. Yeah.
What's she like growing up?
The same as she is as she comes over now. Exactly the same. She hasn't really changed.
But to people that don't know her and all they know is just what they've seen on TV, how would you describe your daughter, the teacher astronaut?
Oh, very caring, outgoing, excited, interested.
I would think, as father, this is just, I mean, you just got to be really proud.
Yes, absolutely proud.
What do you hope that she gets out of this, or is able to give others out of this? Is there something that she can pass on to others, or?
Well, I think that we hope the same as what she's hoping to bring back when she talks about demystifying space, and to come back and let all the other people know that it's not just scientists up there, that for the future everybody will be into space. And I think that's what she hopes to bring back to her children and to the teachers and to everybody in general.
How has she been just in talking to you all about the training and everything?
Totally excited. I mean, she never goes down low about anything. She's truly right with it all the time. She loves what she's doing. No complaints. But she's got that kind of a disposition anyway. She doesn't complain.
I imagine you all are looking forward to that point where she comes back and just tells you everything.
Yes, and to have her back, too.
Edward Corrigan. The Commander-in-Chief, President Reagan, at the White House, learned about this tragedy. He was in his office, in the Oval Office, and he was preparing to meet with a group of reporters and network anchormen, myself included. We were waiting in the Roosevelt room, and we didn't notice when Donald Reagan, the Chief of Staff, got up and left the room, and we didn't notice a few other things, but we learned later that Vice President George Bush and the National Security Advisor, Admiral John Poindexter, who was sitting 2 seats to my right at the table in the Roosevelt room, he slipped out. Charles Bierbauer, you're there at the northwest lawn of the White House. You were in the room, and you can tell us more.
Well, Bernie, at that point, we heard the president, of course, expressed his horror, his concern at the tragedy that he had, in fact, himself seen unfold watching a replay on the television. It was just at that point that we found out that what had happened, and the president found out about it at the same time. When the president did come in and talk with us, you recall, he said that he thought he would go ahead with the State of the Union address as scheduled this evening. In fact, in the draft, there had been a reference to the space program and the fact that the shuttle was up in space, sort of part of the president's look forward to the 21st century. He indicated, as he spoke with us, that he would certainly make reference to this tragedy into the State of the Union address tonight, and he felt that it was important to let people know that life goes on. However, in the span of the next hour, the president had some second thoughts, obviously, about that. He's canceled the State of the Union address after consultation with leaders on Capitol Hill, the feeling it was better to put it off for a week. He'll make the State of the Union address next Tuesday night rather than tonight. And White House spokesman Larry Speakes explained what went through the president's mind, why in that span of an hour he changed his mind.
Like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry, can you tell us what information the president is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the president has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.
Is there a special task force either at the White House or somewhere that's keeping him informed, or are there special communications channels set up?
As is always, when there is an event of this nature that occurs anywhere around the world, the White House Situation Room keeps on top of the events. What happened was, as soon as this event occurred almost simultaneously with the television coverage of it, the Situation Room was informed by NASA and has kept abreast of it with an open line to NASA at the Cape since that time.
The president will speak to the nation tonight on television about the shuttle tragedy. He has sent Vice President Bush and the director of NASA down to Florida to get together with people down there to find out just what has happened, to convey the president's sincere sympathies to the families of the astronauts who were involved. White House spokesman Larry Speakes called this a tragedy of major proportion, but said that there is no finger pointing at NASA in any sense, that the safety record of NASA has been remarkable up to this point. He said, indeed, that the president's only concern right now is to find out what has happened, to express his concern, and that's the primary thought on the president's mind at this point. One other note, First Lady Nancy Reagan was also watching television this morning when the tragedy occurred. Her remarks, as conveyed by her, the First Lady's press office, were that it's time we should start praying that there is some thread of hope. And while the White House will not say and is not in a position to describe the fate of the 7 astronauts, there is really very little hope here. Bernie?
Thank you, Charles. Charles Bierbauer reporting live from the White House. Joining us now on Newsday, John Logsdon with the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in the nation's capital. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, we've been taking risks in front of the world really since Alan Shepard's flight in May of 1961. Even at that point, when the first American was going to go into space, there was a major debate of whether to do it live in front of a camera. And the decision then was, yes, that was the kind of program we were going to have. recognizing the risks. The risks now have arrived. Unlike the Soviets, who only announced their manned flights after they're successful, we do this as a sense of common accomplishment, recognizing the risks. Unfortunately, the risks occurred.
That's an interesting point. At that briefing in the Roosevelt Room, President Reagan, he came in and he talked to us for about 12 minutes, a little over, about 75 minutes ago. And I asked the president, I said, philosophically, Mr. Reagan, do you take any solace in the fact that the U.S. space program, as we know it, has been safer than the Soviets, that the Soviets have lost many more people? And President Reagan looked down the table at me and he said, quote, it's something to cling to right now, but it doesn't lessen the grief, unquote.
No, not at all. This is a risky business yet. We're on the edges of human exploration and human achievement. We're taking the kind of risks required to do exciting, adventurous, and valuable things. And everybody that was involved in this, from Krista McAuliffe to Commander Scobie, knew quite well that it was a risk and were willing to undertake that risk.
Also today, Mr. Reagan underscored that a reporter asked him how he felt about the fact that the teacher was on board, and President sort of said, in fact, he said, it's the last frontier. Those were his words.
Indeed. I think the identification of the public with the fact that one of them, an ordinary citizen, happened to be aboard this mission, not the 24 that went before it, I think broadens the tragedy, and therefore is bad luck is understating it by several orders of magnitude. There were 6 others who had dedicated their careers to the shuttle program on this, and their loss for the program is equally as great. For the country, I guess the identification is with Krista, though.
Have you any fear whatsoever that NASA's outstanding record with safety and achievement will be lost in the wake of a backlash because of this tragedy?
I hope not. That would be totally irrational behavior. This country is capable of behaving irrationally in crisis situations, and I think Mr. Reagan has said that what is needed now is to find out what happened, fix it, and go ahead with the program, and that's exactly the right response, that there are too many things worth doing that the people that were on this mission had dedicated themselves to stop, to say it's not worth doing, that because of this accident the program will not go ahead, would be, among other things, a tragedy for those that were involved in this accident.
What about our national sense of presumption? We Americans over the past decade or so became so attuned to the space program operating functionally very well, being well funded, safety being way up there. It's almost as if we've taken this very dangerous program for granted. We never had tragedies per se, except the ones that we've been reporting on prior to this one today. And it's as if we didn't watch these launches after a couple of years because they were so routine. I suppose maybe we should have been reminded with each launch that this is very dangerous, and we're very fortunate.
Well, but it is supposed to be routine. That's the idea of the program now, is that each launch is not an adventure. Of course it is for the individuals involved. So is driving to work in the morning or getting on a 747. The necessity is making sure the resources, the people, the funding to assure constant safety is available. To shortcut the program would enhance the chance of something like this happening.
Certainly there will be a full-scale, full-court press kind of investigation. But based on the videotapes you've seen, based on what you know about this vehicle, what's your hunch as to what happened?
Well, first of all, I haven't seen the videotapes, and I'm not sure I want to, since I wasn't exposed to them in the first place. I think it's almost irresponsible to begin to say, well, it was external tank rupturing, or because it was cold, or some of the other things that I've heard already. The people who are close in, who have the data, are the people that ought to say what happened. there's, of course, a pressing curiosity, but there's not much we can do about it. And I think it's, as I say, almost irresponsible for those not close to the technical character of what went on to be running around talking about what happened.
Your reservation is appreciated. John Longston with the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in the nation's capital.
Thank you.
Now, let's go to our man in Atlanta, Tom Mintier. Tom?
Thank you, Bernie. For those who may be just joining us, let's turn the clock back a few hours now and take you to a replay from the Kennedy Space Center just a few moments before Challenger lifted off at 11:39 after several hours of delay because of ice problems on the structure surrounding the shuttle. They sent a crew of 8 men out to knock that ice off. The main engines have started here. It appeared everything was normal.
1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling. Roger, roll, Challenger.
The roll maneuver taking place. Everything still looked normal about 20 seconds into flight. This is the VIP viewing area, taking pictures as they normally do every time there is a shuttle flight.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 90.
Everything appeared normal here.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
In a second, they were ordered to throttle up. And then the last words from the shuttle.
Throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Huge ball of fire and the solid rockets veering out of control. One went left and then curved. Here's the slow motion replay. You see a fire between the shuttle and the external tank. And then an explosion right at the point where the shuttle and the tank are connected, and a huge fireball. Recovery efforts. Here are the spectators watching as the shuttle cleared the pad.
We have no downrange.
There is Krista McCullough's parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan. They were told by a NASA official, walked up to them and said the vehicle had exploded. Mrs. Corrigan, stunned, looked back at him and repeated his words as a question. The vehicle has exploded, and then they were led away. Let's go now to Bernie Shaw in Washington. Bernie?
Thank you, Tom. The chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico, is in the Senate Radio TV gallery. Let's listen in.
Very human, wonderful people. The experts, the astronauts are very marvelous aviators and technical people. They did their share. Something just happened, and we don't know what it is yet.
Senator, did you see the explosion, and what was your first reaction?
Yeah, it was purely accidental. I came back from the White House, was sitting behind my desk, doing some other work, and a staffer walked in and said, it blew up. And I said, what blew up? And they said, the Space Shuttle. I said, on the ground? No, in space. We turned on the TV, and there they were replaying it. So I was not watching it live, but it was just the same as if it was live because I'd heard very little before, maybe 40 seconds. As it did that, I really couldn't believe that it was happening. I kept looking for something to come out the other end, and it didn't. So it was a rather amazing sight for me, and in fact, I thought maybe it was something else for a while. Okay? Thank you all very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Members of the 99th Congress still reacting to this tragedy. You've often heard the word redundancy in our space systems. Lots of safety precautions taken, lots of safety procedures involved, escape procedures. Tom Mcnair tells us about it.
Bernie, there used to be ejection seats that had parachutes on the space shuttle. Recently, as the program advanced and they had more and more shuttles online, they removed those seats to allow more room for scientific experiments and other things to be in the space shuttle. The investigation, of course, is going to go on for a long, long time, barely just getting started now. All really that NASA has right now to work with is some of the data that was going on for that first 1 minute in space that was sent down by a downlink dish from the Challenger into their recording banks. They say they have secured all of that information, and they, of course, will be going over it. There is a contingency plan when something goes wrong on the space shuttle. It's something that the people at NASA never really talked too much about. The last time was when we had the engines of the shuttle shut down on the pad last summer, and then people started asking the questions, what would happen if something went wrong? Here is a freeze frame of where it appears a fire broke out between the external tank and the space shuttle. In a diagram, you can see how the external tank is connected in several places to the shuttle. Here, in this book, shows two areas where explosive charges are placed by NASA, in that point and in that point. There is also a propellant line that runs down here to supply the shuttle's main engines. Now, not saying that the craft was triggered from the ground, but that contingency exists. If the shuttle had veered way off course, a range officer at Cape Canaveral Air Force Base could have thrown a switch that would have sent an encrypted signal to the shuttle to blow it up. It is a contingency plan that NASA has on its books, but it appeared from the video and from everything we know so far that the shuttle was not veering wildly off course, that it was continuing downrange to a point about 9 miles. Of course, the investigation is just getting started, and it may take months or even years to know what happened because so little will be left. Lou?
All right, Tom, and CNN's live coverage of this morning's tragedy at the Kennedy Space Center will continue throughout the day and night. The next major event we're anticipating is a briefing at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration at 3:30 Eastern Time. That's in a little less than an hour. At that time, we hope to learn more about the search and recovery efforts now going on off the coast of Florida. Michael J. Smith was the Navy commander who was piloting the space shuttle this morning when it exploded just about a minute after liftoff. With us now is CNN's own Nick Gregory, our meteorologist who was once accepted at the Huntsville, Alabama Space and Rocket Center in the simulation program, and you sat in the seat in the simulator that Michael Smith, the pilot of the Challenger flight this morning, was sitting in. Elucidate about what happens there.
Well, the pilot's responsibility, Lou, is, again, as pilot of the mission, he is responsible for flying the mission. The commander is in charge of the entire mission. The pilot, during launch, monitors all the information systems, monitors the engine performance. As we were hearing in the playback from NASA, when the command is given, go at throttle up. He is the one responsible for monitoring that the computer is handling the throttle up procedures. Now, this is a simulator, almost the size of the same simulator that I went through. This is at the Johnson Space Flight Center in Houston, the exact simulator that all of them train on, and it is very important to keep in mind that space travel, the way we know it today, on the Challenger or on Discovery, on all of our shuttles, could not be made possible unless you were to try to go through it in a space simulator, because they are throwing at you all the emergency procedures through it. Now we're looking at video of the Challenger crew as they were training for the mission. Mike Smith leading the way at the top of the stairs there, again entering the orbiter, which is put in a launch position. It's simulated there as a liftoff position. They are going to practice getting into the orbiter as they would on the launch pad, putting on their helmets and their harnesses, which they need. There's Krista McAuliffe, again, as she prepares herself to get into the orbiter. We do the same kind of simulation that they would do over there at the Johnson Space Flight Center. I was experiencing the same kind of activity you see here, preparing to go into the orbiter, then strapping in for liftoff. Then they threw a few emergencies at our crew, and once you're on board the orbiter, you must look at possibilities of, again, for an emergency. Is there going to be a return to the landing site? Will there be a transatlantic abort? They do have what is called an emergency egress procedure, where if something were to happen on the pad, they can quickly open the hatch, and they have these escape modules waiting on the launch pad area that they hop into and essentially steer them off to safety down this long rope that takes them off to a safe area away from the launch pad. Now, once you get into liftoff, again, the first 2 minutes of the flight where you're with the solid rocket boosters, there's really not much you can do if an emergency occurs except to go away from the main engine, go away from the solid rocket pack that you have, and to go away from the liquid and hydrogen fuel cell. Now, this is today's crew as they were training. Again, you can see Krista McAuliffe getting ready to go into the orbiter as she would board the orbiter normally, and then they will strap themselves in for a simulated launch. And believe me, the simulations are quite realistic. They simulate the entire thing for you.
The last words from the Space Shuttle this morning, Nick, full throttle up. What was happening at that stage?
At that point, the orbiter is passing through, or just had passed through what is called max Q, which is an area where the most aerodynamic pressure is being experienced by the orbiter as it goes up towards space travel. So the command is given just before that for the pilot, or actually the computer, let's say, with the pilot monitoring the system, to throttle back, and they throttle back to about 65%, not to allow, again, the pressure to build up on the orbiter. Once they pass through the area, the word from mission control is, orbiter, you're go at throttle up, and then the computer throttles back to 104% maximum thrust, and the pilot acknowledges that the orbiter is doing just that.
Are you familiar with the evolution of the Space Shuttle program from the time when Columbia had the ejection seats to this flight of the Challenger, which had no means of escape for the astronauts?
Yes, I am. The Columbia, when it was using as a test shuttle, let's say, the first few missions that were just test shuttles, they had it equipped with ejection seats. Once they proved, again, that they felt it was safe, they took the ejection seats out to allow more seats to be placed into the orbiter, because the ejection seats are so big, they cannot allow more seats into the orbiter for the other crew members. Like in this case, we had 7 crew members, so that would just not be possible with ejection seats.
All right, Nick Gregory, and now to Lee Green, who's on the line from Concord, New Hampshire. He's at the Concord High School, the school at which Krista McAuliffe taught, and where students this morning were watching the horror on television just a minute after liftoff. Lee, what's happening there?
Well, to sum it up in a couple of words, Lou, as you can imagine, stunned disbelief in this Miss McAuliffe's home. She was a very popular woman around here who taught at Concord High School, where, as you mentioned, the students were watching on television this morning. They were sent home just over an hour ago, many of them in tears, the look of shock very evident on their faces, we understand. It never occurred to most of the students that anything could go wrong with the shuttle. It's been such a smooth program up till now. At the very most, they'd expressed some impatience over the series of delays that plagued this particular shuttle. Many don't know what to make of the thing so far. We heard one one student saying that he's changed his plans to get into the space program. It certainly put him off the whole thing. Krista McAuliffe's immediate family, including her husband and parents, are at the Cape, and they've been taken away by NASA officials. They apparently were unaware right at the beginning what had happened, and didn't know that there had been this disaster until they were informed by NASA officials. Krista McAuliffe had planned to keep a diary in the air and to try and express the common person's point of view of space flight. She's going to be very much missed in Concord, and certainly that record is a loss to the world.
Lee, can you describe that moment in the classroom earlier this morning when we understand that reporters and cameramen were asked to leave?
I wish I could, Lou. I wasn't there. We've only just made it into Concord, but I understand.
What do you know about it?
It was not a very pleasant scene from what we're hearing about it. There was a great deal of shock and disbelief, as I'm saying, and it was quite a trauma for the students who, as I say, were sent home shortly after that.
Well, how many students were involved? You know, was this a school-wide?
Oh yes, the whole school would have been watching this morning, and they had planned, of course, to watch So the entire school would have been watching, and what we're hearing from there is that it's a very unhappy scene, as you can imagine.
All right, Lee Green in Concord, New Hampshire, at the Concord High School, the school at which Krista McAuliffe, one of the 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, who died this morning apparently died this morning about a minute after liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center. It was the first in-flight disaster in 56 U.S. manned space missions, and we're still gathering information on it. We'll have a NASA briefing in about 47 minutes. Both the United States and Soviet Union have had serious setbacks as they've explored space over the past quarter century. Some astronauts have died before, and CNN's Bill McGowan has a report on that.
Tragedy struck once before in the U.S. space program. In 1967, 3 astronauts were killed when fire swept through their Apollo spacecraft as it was being tested on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. The deaths of Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee are the only fatalities on board a spacecraft in the U.S. space program. That fire apparently started when an electrical spark ignited the oxygen-rich atmosphere in the spacecraft. The tragedy delayed the Apollo program for nearly 2 years while safety features were added. The Soviets were first in space with Sputnik in 1957 and first with a man in space with Yuri Gagarin's 1961 Earth orbit. They too have paid a cost in human life. A cosmonaut was killed during a 1967 spaceflight when the craft's parachute failed to open on returning to Earth. In 1971, 3 Soviet cosmonauts were found dead in their return spacecraft after 24 days in orbit. Despite spectacular achievements like landing men on the moon, America's space effort has been plagued with technical problems from its earliest days. The Space Shuttle program has had its share of technical troubles. The Shuttle Challenger has had earlier flights aborted because of fuel contamination, and one of its missions was cut short when an engine shut down in flight. The frequent launch postponements underline NASA's concern for safety factors, but today's tragedy emphasizes that human ingenuity cannot eliminate the element of danger from the exploration of space. Bill McGowan, CNN.
A member of the Senate Science and Transportation Committee, Republican Larry Pressler of South Dakota, is in the Senate Radio TV gallery. He has some thoughts about today's tragedy.
We have to protect them. We have to continue to explore this area in terms of national defense, as well as exploring the efficient movement of people. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Pressler joining others of his colleagues who've come forward to express themselves not just as members of this Congress, but also as Americans grieving the loss of the Americans who presumably were lost in today's tragedy involving the shuttle mission. Your network of record will continue its live coverage of developments as they come up. We're expecting here from Washington at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon a briefing at the NASA building on what the latest is. As you know, Vice President George Bush is traveling down to Florida, to the Cape, to be with the families. And President Reagan now has delayed the State of the Union address because of what has happened, put it off for a week. Larry Speaks says the president indeed does feel exactly what you, I, all Americans, and all persons around this planet are feeling. Back to Tom Mcnair now in Atlanta. Tom?
Bernie, as you were saying, the investigation will probably take months or even years to complete. The recovery efforts that were launched in the area of Cape Canaveral Air Force Base, a C-130 and several ships, including a Coast Guard cutter, moved into the area, but it was at least 55 minutes before they could move into the impact area, which was estimated to be about 9 miles downrange. NASA says the reason they were not able to move in any sooner than that was the fact that the debris from Challenger was still falling from the sky. We saw in our live pictures several pieces of large chunks that were falling down either from the external tank or from Challenger itself. Challenger has had problems before, technical problems before. Back in July, it aborted a launch with just seconds left when a computer detected a problem with one of the fuel lines and aborted the launch. About 17 days later, Challenger did blast off, but about 5 minutes and 15 seconds into the flight, a monitoring sensor on board Challenger reported overheating in one of the shuttle's main engines. And for the first time in the space program's history, an engine was shut down in flight. They were able to continue that flight on into a lower than expected orbit and able to continue on with their mission as scheduled. It went into that lower orbit with the remaining 2 engines simply by running them a little longer than expected. For those of you who may be just joining us, the accident occurred about 1 minute after liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center. There had been several delays throughout the morning because of concern about ice. Ice from freezing temperatures. It went down below freezing late last night, and there was concern as far back as Sunday about the cold temperatures that they would be launching under. They sent a crew out to the pad area about a half an hour before they launched to clean off some ice. 2-foot icicles were hanging from the structure that surrounds the space shuttle, and they went out and knocked those icicles off. They had an emergency meeting just prior to that when they decided that it would not cause a problem if there was ice on those structures. They decided by going out and taking them off that they could go ahead and proceed with the count. Yesterday, of course, they did not go because of winds at the landing area, the 3-mile runway at the Kennedy Space Center that would have been used had there not been an explosion. If the external tank had simply separated from the shuttle, they were able to then glide back to the area. They have several areas that they can glide to. At the earliest point, it is the 3-mile runway at the Kennedy Space Center, and then after a little farther in powered flight, it is a transatlantic abort site over in Spain and a new one established in Morocco. But 1 minute into the flight, a huge ball of fire and smoke erupted around the shuttle, and then there was nothing left. Lou?
Okay, Tom, it could be pointed out that this shuttle Challenger that exploded today has had troubles before. In July of last year, just before launch, a computer detected contamination in Challenger's hydrogen fuel and aborted that launch. 17 days later, Challenger blasted off, but 5 minutes and 15 seconds into that flight, a monitoring device reported overheating in one of the main engines. And for the first time in history of the space program, an engine was shut down in flight before the shuttle Challenger reached its orbit. The pictures are horrifying, a feeling of disbelief when they were first shown live this morning here on CNN. We'll show them to you again, beginning just before liftoff at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
Started. T-minus 21 seconds, and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Those who apparently died this morning aboard the 25th shuttle mission. Francis R. Dick Scobie, spacecraft commander. He was born May 19th, 1939 in Washington State. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978, received a BS degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Arizona in 1965. Judith Resnik was a PhD. She was one of the 3 mission specialists aboard this flight. She was born April 5th, 1949 in Akron, Ohio. She received a BS degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She became an astronaut in 1978. There was Sharon Krista McAuliffe, who is a teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. She was selected as the first citizen in space for the NASA Teacher in Space project in July of '85. Krista, as she liked to be called, was born September 2nd, 1948 in Boston. She received a BA degree from Framingham State College and a master's degree in education from Bowie State College in Bowie, Maryland. Ellison Onazuki was on board, lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. He was a mission specialist. He became an astronaut in 1978, born June 24th, 1946, in Hawaii. He received a BS and MS degrees in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Gregory B. Jarvis, a payload specialist, a laser specialist, was on board. He was born August 24th, 1944, in Detroit. He received a BS degree in electrical engineering from the State University of New York at Buffalo, an MS degree in electrical engineering from Northeastern University in Boston. Ronald E Mcnair, a PhD mission specialist, became an astronaut in the class of 1978. He was born October 21st, 1950 in Lake City, South Carolina. He received a BS degree in physics from North Carolina, A&T State University, and a PhD in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Those were the people aboard the Space Shuttle this morning. Joining us on the line now from the Kennedy Space Center, CNN's John Zarella. John, update on recovery efforts.
Yes, Lou, I was just informed just a few moments ago that the recovery vehicles, this comes from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Nicholson of the Department of Defense, that the recovery vehicles have spotted some floating debris, including what appears to be a piece of debris with a parachute on it. Now, of course, he says that to qualify that, of course, that could be part of the SRB, the solid rocket booster, which would have returned to Earth with the parachute, those reusable boosters. There is still no word on the orbiter's location, if indeed any parts of the orbiter are still intact. The swells in the Atlantic are running 15 to 18 feet. Visibility is very low out there at the site of the recovery operation, so helicopters have now been sent back to Patrick Air Force Base to wait for the low cloud cover to clear. But again, just to update you, they have identified pieces of floating debris, one of which appears to have a parachute attached to it. Lou?
All right, John Zarella at the Kennedy Space Center. We'll be in touch with you again. Floating debris has been spotted by the recovery teams now working off the Kennedy Space Center. Science correspondent Tom Mentier now.
Lou, NASA's ambitious schedule of 15 missions this year, there have been problems from the start, starting in December of last year. That was when Columbia was scheduled to lift off from the Kennedy Space Center. It didn't leave until 1986. And there were problems with the weather, problems with mechanics, and then the problems really rubbed off into Challenger as it waited while Columbia circled trying to find a place to land. They tried to bring it back to the Kennedy Space Center, but were unable to because of bad weather at the Kennedy Space Center a couple of weeks ago. So then when it finally landed at Edwards Air Force Base in California and was brought back aboard a 747, Challenger had been sitting on the launch pad for quite some time. Originally scheduled on the 22nd, there have been 5 postponements of this mission. The record was Columbia with 7. There were 3 weather postponements. Yesterday, we saw problems not only with the weather, but with the mechanical aspects. The handle on the outside of the entry hatch that leads into the shuttle evidently stripped a screw. This was noticed after they found that the micro switches were not closing properly on the shuttle, on the doorway, and they were getting some sensors in the inside of the cabin that they were not closing properly. Then they discovered that the handle, which is taken off before flight, had the screw stripped. They then sent away for a drill to take that screw out so they could go ahead and continue with the countdown. At that point, they were still planning on going. When the drill arrived, it had a dead battery in it. They had to send away again. They were delayed nearly by 2 hours, this all occurring at a time when the weather was okay for the launch. Finally, they had to cut the bolt off, the titanium bolt, which is super hard, with a hacksaw. After they cut the bolt off, they removed the handle, went ahead and put the thermal protection into place. But after waiting for nearly 2 hours through good weather, bad weather once again moved into the launch area, and the winds at the runway, where they would have returned had there been a problem then, were in excess of 30 miles an hour. These are not acceptable to NASA flight rules, so they decided to scrub again for today. There was some concern yesterday about the temperatures falling in Florida. They reported that it was snowing yesterday in Jacksonville for about 8 minutes, so there was some concern about the cold temperatures. They monitored it into last night. They decided that they could go ahead and fill the external tank with oxygen and hydrogen, and that tanking took place about an hour late, an hour behind schedule, because there were some problems with the fire suppression equipment on the pad. They were evidently not acclimating to the cold weather. By then, the temperature was below freezing. This morning, 24 degrees on the launch pad. They continued the count, got into this morning, decided to move it back because of those problems with the fire suppression, moved it back 1 hour from 9:37 to 10:37, and at that point, they decided to move it back another hour when they noticed that there was some ice on some of the remote service structures surrounding the space shuttle. They sent a team of 8 men up who worked for about a half an hour knocking those 2-foot-long icicles off. NASA had an emergency meeting to decide if they would go ahead with the count. The decision was made at that point to go ahead with the count. They went down and launched Challenger, and a minute into flight, it exploded. Lou?
All right, Tom. On the line now, Frank Seltzer at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Frank, what are you hearing there?
Lou, there are more questions than there are answers right now. Nobody really knows for certain exactly what happened. Word from mission control that we have had so far was that about a minute 15 into the flight, all telemetry stopped at about the same time as when you saw the fireball that became the Challenger. Basically, the reaction here has been one of stunned silence. There are about 20 people in the public affairs office, mostly NASA contractors, watching the liftoff. And it was like, as it was for me and for many other people, I'm sure, you watched it, and it wasn't quite certain what happened at first. It looked like the solid rocket motors had, in fact, jettisoned, and then the realization that, no, in fact, it had exploded and Challenger was no more. That was the reaction in the public affairs office and also here in Building 2, which is the visitor center at the Johnson Space Center. People are walking around a bit in the days wondering what happened, and they are taking it personally here in Houston, where it is also called Space City, the home of the Johnson Space Center. So it's right now, there's going to be a news conference in about a half hour from the Kennedy Space Center. They hope to try and answer some questions, but the word is around Mission Control that right now there are just questions and no seemingly answers.
All right, Frank Seltzer, we'll be getting back to you at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the nerve center of the space flight program. Now to Mary Alice Williams in New York.
You know, the manned space flight program had finally reached a new goal. The test pilots who led the way had opened the way for civilians, just people who could learn and teach us and our children about the miracle and necessity of space exploration. What better choice than a teacher?
It was supposed to be the ultimate field trip. Third graders from Krista McAuliffe's Concord, New Hampshire hometown, bound for Cape Canaveral and the blast-off of a spaceship.
Well, I think it's really neat because
she's going to be the first private citizen in space. It's going to be very exciting watching it go off. I'm used to seeing Mrs. McAuliffe like out raking her yard or something, not floating around in space.
Expectations also ran high in New Jersey as a gifted group of science students prepared to simulate the shuttle launch. Ever optimistic, the interrupted countdown of America's 25th shuttle expedition would finally be a go. Now school officials prepare to grapple with NASA's worst nightmare.
Once they had seen the evidence on the visual screen that there would be no survivors, it suddenly became apparent to them that they were dealing with death.
From a Soviet official in Washington, condolences and expressions of sympathy for the crew members' families.
We regret loss of lives of the crew, and we express deep sympathy to the relatives and friends of the perished astronauts.
In New York, producers and the studio crew of a Sesame Street program watched in horror as the spacecraft blew apart.
Because it's never happened before, I think possibly many people even involved.
The shocking spectacle was also seen in a city bar.
One of the most unbelievable things I've ever seen in my lifetime. I can't remember ever seeing anything like that, especially not with a NASA-related expedition. I'm appalled at it. I feel very bad for the families of those involved.
In a moment of mourning, one New Yorker paused to put the nation's loss into perspective.
It's just a terrible pity, it really is. But again, it shouldn't stop our program because we've got to keep going. It's doing so much for us in other areas.
We continue our live coverage of this national loss with Bernie Shaw in Washington.
Thank you, Mary Alice. This tragedy involving Challenger has affected the highest office in our land. President Reagan has decided to call off his planned State of the Union message to Congress and the nation tonight. White House spokesman Larry Speakes made the announcement less than an hour ago.
To the tragedy of Space Shuttle Mission 51L, the President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday.
First Lady Nancy Reagan is said to be in a state of shock and great grief for the families of the shuttle astronauts, according to her spokeswoman, Elaine Crispin, who says Mrs. Reagan was at the White House watching live television when the shuttle exploded. Mrs. Reagan said, "Oh my God, no," when she realized what had happened. The House of Representatives was preparing to go into session when it heard about the tragedy. House Chaplain James Ford quickly offered a special prayer for the victims.
And at this special moment, let us remember in silent prayer those who were involved in the spacecraft shuttle accident just a few minutes ago off Florida. Let us pray. May your Spirit, O Lord, be with them, and may your love follow them and their families this day and every day, we pray. Amen.
Reaction on Capitol Hill to the shuttle tragedy was strong and quick.
With hearts heavy in trauma and deeply felt sorrow, the nation today pays honor and tribute to these brave young Americans and extends its hand to their families, their loved ones, their comrades, in such small ways as we can.
We've come to accept these flights as being so routine, and yet it's so highly sophisticated, highly technological in nature, that any little thing can go wrong. Remind me again of how mysteriously, or God moves in mysterious ways. I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are.
Joining us now is Marcia Smith. She's with the National Commission on Space. In fact, she is the executive director. And before she came on here, she was telling me that President Reagan and Congress have charged her office with the responsibility of looking to the future of the space program. Ms. Smith, thanks for coming in and joining us on such short notice. You're concerned about the space program in view of this tragedy?
I'm not sure it's fair to say that I'm concerned about the space program. I'm greatly hopeful that the space program will continue on very vigorously. But obviously this is a terrible tragedy, and I just hope that NASA is able to determine with certainty exactly what went wrong so that it can make sure it never happens again.
Tell us more about your office and your charge.
The commission was established by Congress and the President about 1.5 years ago to look at the long-range future of the space program. There was a feeling that NASA was doing very well in the present with the shuttle flights, which have been going very well until today, but that they were not looking to the very long-term future, 20 years from now, for example. So we were set up to look at that and to establish recommendations for what to do in the long range.
What are you recommending?
The commission is still preparing the report, and all of the recommendations are not final. The chairman of the commission is Tom Paine, a former administrator of NASA, and he has said himself publicly that the overall thrust of the report is going to be opening up the inner solar system for science and exploration and development. And of course, there is a very strong manned component of that. So we certainly hope that this will not affect the manned program in the long-term future, but I think we can certainly expect that it will be some time before we see another shuttle launch.
When we do see another shuttle launch, and given the projection that you cited with yourself and Mr. Payne looking into the future, could one assume that there would be manned space flight even farther into space?
Well, certainly in the very long-term future, that's what most people think about. They think of going back to the moon and establishing bases there of some sort, and then going on perhaps to Mars and establishing bases there for scientific exploration and for developing resources there that could send us out even further into the solar system.
Are you really fearful that, notwithstanding NASA's exemplary space record, that there might become a backlash to the program because of this tragedy?
There's always that concern. That didn't happen at the time of the Apollo fire in 1967 or at the near tragedy that we had with Apollo 13. And I have great confidence in the American people that they will not suddenly turn their back on the manned program. The manned program has given us many, many benefits throughout all of society, and I'm sure that it will continue to do so.
Any idea of the magnitude of the tragedies that have befallen the Soviet space program?
The Soviets have lost 4 cosmonauts in space-related accidents in 1967, just 3 months after the Apollo fire, in which our 3 astronauts were killed. The first pilot of the Soyuz 1 spacecraft, Vladimir Komarov, was killed. And then in 1971, 3 more cosmonauts were killed in the Soyuz 11 accident when the atmosphere inside their spacecraft cabin depressurized during re-entry and they were asphyxiated. So they've had a total of 4 who died in space flights.
Is it generally universal in space program circles, as Senator John Glenn said he believes personally, that everyone realized that at some point something like this had to happen? Is that generally accepted as a possibility?
As horrible as it sounds, yes, I think it is generally accepted that sooner or later there was going to be a tragedy and a crew would be lost. I don't think any of us thought it would be this soon. And whenever it happened, it would have been just as horrible.
And just to be sure we get your full thoughts on this, why? Why the acceptance of that?
Simply because this is a very risky enterprise. It's the same reason that we accept the fact that there are going to be airplane crashes, but we take airplanes nevertheless. We accept that there will be automobile crashes, but we drive automobiles nonetheless. It's a risky business.
And finally, one last question to ask of you. Will this tragedy affect the Commission's report? What does it do, first of all, and how will this tragedy have an effect, if indeed it will, on the Commission's report?
Well, it truly is too early to tell. We are in the midst of writing our recommendations right now, and the plan had been to give the report to the President around April 11th. We were timing that because it's a Friday, and the 12th, which regrettably is a Saturday, is the 5th anniversary of the first shuttle launch. I would not be surprised if our own deliberations were stretched out, because one of our most vocal members of the Commission is astronaut Kathy Sullivan, and I'm quite certain that for the next few weeks at least, she will not be able to participate in our deliberations because she'll be busy helping NASA find out what went wrong. So I would not be surprised if our report slipped, but perhaps we can still get it in on schedule.
Marcia Smith, Executive Director of the National Commission on Space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to Lou Waters in Atlanta.
All right, Bernie, millions of Americans were watching the liftoff of the Shuttle Challenger this morning, including those intimately involved with the manned spaceflight program. We've heard the reaction from the Kennedy Space Center, the Johnson Space Center in Houston. Andrew Holtz tells us the reaction from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena this morning.
Almost everyone at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory watched the launch and saw the explosion. Groups of workers and reporters stood around monitors waiting for word about the cause of the failure. Some members of the press corps were near tears, even as they speculated about what happened.
Game one.
Foreign correspondents spread the unhappy news around the world. NASA JPL employees offered each other sympathy. But mostly, the people here stood silently, in shock. A Voyager press briefing was scheduled to follow the shuttle launch. It was to be the culmination of the week-long Uranus encounter, a day for congratulations on a mission of space exploration well done. But all that vanished in the explosion of Challenger. Andrew Holtz, CNN, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California.
If we were to put a face on this shuttle flight, it would be that of Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old. She was one of the 7 crew members aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning when it exploded. We have a profile from CNN's Carol Buckland, who starts with the moment McAuliffe stepped into the spotlight of a massive NASA talent search.
Krista McAuliffe from Concord, New Hampshire. One of the things that I would like to do when I go aboard the shuttle is to bring back the wonder of it all.
Those were Krista McAuliffe's words when she was introduced to the press last July 1st as one of the 10 finalists in the Teacher in Space program. She was one of more than 11,000 teachers who'd applied for the honor. She told NASA she wanted to demystify spaceflight and to humanize the technology of the space age.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Where's that you?
Less than 3 weeks later, this then 36-year-old high school social studies teacher was tapped to become the first average citizen in space. It was an emotional moment.
When that shuttle goes, there might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
That's great.
Her husband, Steve, and 9-year-old son, Scott, and 6-year-old daughter, Carolyn, received the news with understandable pride. So, it seemed, did her whole hometown of Concord, New Hampshire. But beyond the hoopla of being an instant celebrity, McAuliffe was faced with the demands of being an astronaut in training. Despite a few joking complaints about the close quarters on the shuttle, she said it was like putting 6 people in a pup tent. She clearly relished the challenge. She also devoted a great deal of time to what were to have been 2 live televised lessons from space. The first of those, which was to have given school children around the country a glimpse of daily shuttle life, had been billed as the ultimate field trip. In an interview shortly before her tragic death, McAuliffe reflected on what she was doing. She said she hoped to inspire others to reach out and try new and different things.
That message can get back to kids and to anybody, that, you know, to go for it. You know, to go ahead and push for something. Maybe that you don't know whether you're going to attain it. I had no idea I was ever going to be chosen. But I felt good because I reached out for that.
Television can be very wrenching at a time such as this. Ms. McAuliffe, now let's go to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill.
House and the Minority Leader of the House. It allows us to express our sentiments in this day of sorrow.
The gentleman from California.
Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hayes, 1 minute.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, needless to say, I rise in support of the resolution. I didn't personally know any of the 7 people involved in the flight, except as human beings. I'd like to raise the obvious question which has been trickling around in my mind as I hear the speeches here. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Some have already answered this question. as they mourn for the families and express sympathy. And as we lament over the next few days and try to find out, or the few weeks, what caused it, I just hope as we pray and talk to Lord God Almighty that we ask Him for guidance and give us a sense of direction so that we might determine our purpose for space exploration. I hope our motivation is something more than just trying to keep pace with the Soviet Union. We do it based on a determination and decision as to what it's going to do to help mankind. I couldn't help but listen at the amount of money that went down with these lives of 7 people. $3.2 billion for one spaceship. And how many people who are hungry today that might be helped if we decide to continue. We must understand, and I have not made a decision as to whether or not we should continue or not. I want guidance as to whether or not we go in the right direction. But I think we ought to be able to understand and be motivated for other purposes other than just keep pace with somebody else at the expense and risk of lives. Robots may be used for this purpose. I'm not a scientist, I don't know. Certainly we've had success, and I don't want to ignore it. But I just want us to think, and think deeply, and pray over this situation, and ask the good Lord to give us a sense of direction as to where to go from here.
All time is expired.
Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Texas 1 minute.
Yeah.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues, I join the rest of my colleagues today on behalf of my constituency to extend
the previous speaker, Charles Hayes of Illinois, indicating some of the soul searching that has already begun in Congress. Each member of the House of Representatives, virtually each, those who are on Capitol Hill right now, each is taking a turn to come up and express himself, herself publicly. And we got in at the end of House Speaker Tip O'Neill's remarks. We're going to be replaying those for you, but we wanted to see and hear the report on Ms. McAuliffe.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Roger, go with throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second out. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second out. Speed 9 miles a mile. Generating distance 7 miles per hour.
Joining me now here in Atlanta is Carol Hickson, who is affiliated with the Fernbank Science Center. It's part of the DeKalb County school system in suburban Atlanta. Carol was one of the finalists in the Teacher in Space project. You sat down beside me just a few minutes ago as we were playing the Krista McCullough piece where she was talking about going for it, her enthusiastic spirit. You clearly had some emotion on your face at that time. What are you feeling today?
Well, I think, like the rest of the world, devastation.